Chapter 165. Every time Su Fengyan took a step forward, Wei Wei and the one surnamed Zhao would take 2 steps back, until there was nowhere to retreat. Su Feng came to the window and happened to see the heir apparent of the king of Jing-en and his retinue jump into the water. Su Fengyan narrowed his eyes, feeling deeply moved. At that time, Zhao Hong, the 6th prince, had the greatest influence. The Empress Dowager regarded this filial son the most highly. The faction of relatives and the leaderless civil officials hit it off. And it was at that time that Zhao Hong wrote the poem, "Raise an army of 1,000,000 to drive away the Mang slaves. Immediately erect a monument on the first peak." That time could be said to be the most glorious period of Prince Jing-en's life. Who would have thought that the mantis stalks the cicada, unaware of the oriole behind? The 2nd prince, who was originally the least favored, suddenly appeared out of nowhere. It was unknown how he obtained the full support of the eunuchs, chamberlains, and military generals. First, he secretly detained the Empress Dowager. Then he launched a series of assassinations. Several powerful relatives died in one night. The posthumous edict appeared again. It was clearly written that the previous emperor wished for the 2nd prince to ascend the throne. The 2nd prince rightfully sat on the emperor's throne and became the current emperor. The 8 princes contended for the throne, causing a disaster. In the end, only one of the former crown prince died. In fact, in the eyes of those with discerning eyes, this could be considered as His Majesty the Emperor being merciful and lenient. It was much better than the deaths of all the princes and grandsons of the previous dynasties. Zhao Hong and the other princes were successively conferred the title of vassal kings, each having their own fiefdom and military power. Although the vassal laws was extremely harsh, Prince Jing and Prince Xiaohong, Prince Huainan, Prince Xiaoying, and the other weaker vassal kings did not utter a single word of complaint that reached the ears of the people under the heavens. Although the vassal laws was extremely harsh, Prince Xiaohong, Prince Huainan, Prince Xiaoying, and the other weaker vassal kings did not complain at all. As for how the master and servant would go to Xiangfan, this was not Su Fengyan's concern. After thinking for a while, he turned to Ningame and said, "Kick the Huang Tulang who fell into the water again. One ship cannot carry so many people. Let the general of the ship take them to Mount Lao. Wang Linquan will be in charge of receiving them. When you kick their butts, don't forget to mention that there is good food and drink at Mount Lao. I have done my best." Ningame accepted the order and left. When the young ladies of the noble families of Qingzhou heard the words of the Beiliang heir, they could not help but laugh. They looked at each other and laughed. To them, the Beiliang heir and the Beiliang heir were people far away in the sky. No matter how much they struggled in the imperial court, they would not be implicated. The Green Party had never participated in direct battles with the vassal kings. The Green Party was known as the best in the imperial court. If not for this, why was the Green Party the only one in 30 provinces? The Beiliang heir in front of them was rather interesting. Even though on the surface he was slapping the face of the Qingzhou Navy, he was secretly targeting the Jing and palace. As a result, the Green Party, who kept a clear distance from the king of Jing and Zhao Hong, felt much more at ease. They guessed that the ancestors would not be angry. It was true that the noble families of Qingzhou were united, but it was obvious that Wei Chang's family was going to be abandoned. Rather than being dragged into the water, it was better to drink tea and enjoy the scenery on the side. To be on the same boat as the Beiliang, His Royal Highness, and enjoy the scenery, how big of a gimmick would it be if word got out? Su Fengyan finally came back to his senses. He walked to the corner, picked up Zhao Hong, and threw him out of the window. He fell into the water with a howl. He then said to Wei Wei, who looked like he was going to trap the beast and fight to the death, "Let's use the ship and bring it outside of Xiangfan City, and we'll write off all our grievances. How about it?" Wei Wei, who had long given up all hope and was prepared to fight to the death, was first stunned. Then his pockmarked face was filled with joy. With a plop, he knelt down and prostrated himself on the ground. In a trembling voice, he said, "Thank you, His Royal Highness." Su Fengyan used his foot to step on Wei Jiao's head and scolded jokingly, "You blind thing. I heard that you've been racking your brains to become sworn brothers with Li Hanlin. Don't you know who he's been taking the blame for all these years? Although Wei Wei was kneeling and had his head stepped on, his heart felt more and more at ease. He raised his head and smiled flatteringly. It's all my fault for not recognizing Mount Tai, a man who knows when to yield and when to stand tall. This was true on and off the bed. Even if it was someone like Wei Wei who only knew how to be an unscrupulous hedonist, there were masters in all three professions. Most of them were able to do something of their own. Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Get up. A man has gold under his knees. What's the matter with kneeling in front of me?" Wei Wei carefully stood up. Just as he let out a sigh of relief, the Bailiang heir's next sentence brought him back to his original state. "Your archery is not bad. It said that you practiced it by killing women. Go shoot an arrow at the son of the governor. If you kill him, I'll introduce you to Li Hanlin. If you don't kill him..." Wei Wei was silent. Chapter 166. When Su Fengyan pretended to wipe the dust off Wei Wei's body, he said in a low voice, "Wang Linquan's silver is my silver. Wang Linquan's grandmother is my grandmother's mountain. Do you really think that Qingzhou belongs to the Green faction? On this trip to Shangfan, there will naturally be people who will help you think of how to impeach the Shitzi, how to act arrogantly on the Spring God Lake, and how to insult the king of Jing'an and beat up Shitzi Zhaosun. However, when you go out to shoot arrows, remember to be clean. This Shitzi can guarantee that the sisters at the table will not gossip. How about it?" Wei Wei bowed and left the cabin with large strides. Su Fengyan sat in front of the table and sat shoulder to shoulder with the oval-faced beauty who was raising her snow-white wrist to brew tea. He sat with the other Qingzhou ladies who were sitting in pairs on long benches. Su Fengyan patiently waited for the spring godhead to drink tea. He unscrupulously looked at the faces and figures of the wealthy ladies around him. Most of them were of average beauty. Only the tea maker beside him had a charm that was close to 81. Su Fengyan openly reached out and hugged her slender waist. Not only that, he stretched out his leg and lightly stepped on her lotus-root little feet. He turned his head to look at the blushing Qingzhou beauty and asked with a smile, "Dare I ask for elder sister's name? This Shitzi has a peach blossom beauty fan. When I return, I will draw elder sister's face on the fan and play with it every day." Play with it every day? The table of red and green orioles and swallows all looked at the oval-faced woman. Their eyes were mixed with mischief and jealousy. Although the woman who was hugged by Su Fengyan had a good upbringing and had always been bold in her actions and words, she still couldn't take it when she was openly teased like this. She didn't dare to dodge, nor did she want to dodge. She lowered her head and pretended to be paying attention to the situation. Her family background was not simple. Among the 4 pillars of the Liang dynasty, the Green faction was the smallest, but its voice was not weak. Among the 12 pillars of the dynasty and the Shang pillar, the Green faction had 4 seats. The ancestor of this woman's family was one of the Shang pillars. In the past 30 years, he had moved between the Ministry of War, Ministry of Revenue, and Ministry of Appointments. He had countless disciples and was known as the roly-poly of 2 dynasties. Someone once joked that the number of times this roly-poly personally witnessed was only slightly less than the old Grand Secretary. Su Fengyan finally drank the tea. He drank it as if it was wine. He smiled and said, "At night, if elder sisters and sisters feel that the blankets are not warm, just tell me, and I will personally bring the thick brocade blankets." Naturally, there was another wave of bashfulness and coquettishness that could only be understood. The oval-faced beauty who was brewing tea quietly looked at Su Fengyan's side profile. She seemed to have noticed something and was in a daze. Su Fengyan turned his head and asked, "What's the matter?" She smiled gently and shook her head. After drinking the tea and winning a table full of laughter, Su Fengyan excused himself and left the cabin. He came to the bow of the ship. Yu Yue did not board the Yellow Dragon Fortress ship. Jiang and I and the old god of swords stood to the side. Wei Wei had already shot dead the dandy surnamed Zhao, who was still holding Yan Huan's arm and calling her brother the day before. She sat on the deck at the stern of the ship, holding her big bow in a daze. Su Fengyan opened his mouth and asked with a smile, "Not seasick anymore?" Jiang and I smiled coldly and said, Isn't this tea delicious? Su Fengyan pulled out a Bailiang arrow that was shot into the hull of the ship and held it in his hand. His body lazily leaned against the railing of the ship and looked at the vast lake. He said softly, "There's no taste. It's far from the spring god tea that I drank on Mount Lao." Jiang and I asked expressionlessly, "Are we really going to Xiangfan?" Su Fengyan nodded. Jiang and I frowned and said, "Are you not afraid that the king of Jing'an, Zhao Heng, will bring out thousands of men and horses to crush you into powder?" Su Fengyan laughed involuntarily and said, "The king of Bailiang, his royal highness, died in Xiangfan. Zhao Heng cannot bear this crime. If he was really ruthless and not so indecisive, the world would be his." Zhao Heng, this vassal king's luck was not bad, but he always felt that everything he did would be in vain. He had ambition, otherwise he would not have said such a thing. If he wanted to benefit the world, his ability was not bad. When Xiangfan was destroyed, there were only 20,000 people left. After changing the flag on the city, these 20,000 people went crazy and wanted to crawl out of Xiangfan. The city became an empty city, a dead city. But under Zhao Heng's rule, he implemented Huang Lao's theory of non-interference. Today, the population of Xiangfan has recovered to a few 100,000 people. The title of being the most important city in the world is true to its name. King of Jing'an, this vassal king title was given very well. Zhao Heng's reputation among the people of Qingzhou is very good. He can be considered the best of the 7 vassal kings. This kind of person cherishes his reputation the most. What do I have to be afraid of? Maybe Zhao Heng will be worried that someone will frame him and will want to send troops to protect me. Little mud man, do you believe me? Jiang and I said with a face of disbelief, "Are you talking nonsense?" The old god of swords smiled faintly. "Little Su is not talking nonsense." Su Fengyan bent the Bailiang standard arrow with both hands and suddenly smiled. "I heard that there are still 100,000 wandering ghosts in Xiangfan that are not willing to leave the city. Little mud man, you have to be careful when the time comes." Jiang Ni's face turned snow white and he said with a strong front, "The one who is afraid of retribution is you. What does it have to do with me?" Back then, if the Pillar State hadn't been determined to besiege Xiangfan and refused to surrender, refusing to leave a life gate open, how could Xiangfan have become Fengdu? 10 years of being trapped in the city, the people in the city were sold like livestock. Kind mothers cut off their flesh to feed their children. Evil fathers threw their children into the cooking pot. The various states of the human world, good and evil, were all magnified in that ghost city. Every inch of wall was an inch of blood. Every inch of grass was an inch of sorrow. The Yin energy in Xiangfan was unimaginable. 10 years of attack and defense, under the strict orders of the imperial court, no scholars or historians were allowed to write about it. How tragic was the truth? Chapter 167. Su Fengyan joked, "That makes sense. When you enter Xiangfan, remember to stay away from me. Otherwise, why would I cut down so many peach trees in Jean Lanting's residence? It's all because Grandpa Wei is a master of the way of 9 bushels of rice, so he carries a few more peach wood swords to slay demons. You better get close to him these days. Otherwise, you'll be haunted by countless ghosts. Women have a Yin body, so their yang energy is far inferior to men's. Even old sword god Li won't be able to save you." Jiang Ni's face turned even paler. She stammered, wanting to refute and encourage herself, but she didn't know what to say. The little clay figurine's appearance had always been ranked in the top 3 beauties Su Fengyan had ever seen in his life. The first was, of course, the androgynous white fox's face. The second was a woman he had seen by the Luoshui River during his 3 years of travel. Until now, he could not tell whether she was a woman from a landowning household or the god of the Luoshui River. However, she was beautiful. She was a woman in her 20s, but her face was still like a pattern in the 19 chess books. No matter how delicate it would not change much. However, the little clay figurine was different. She had been growing over the years. Her breasts, which were in line with the title of Princess Taiping in the past, were no longer Taiping. Instead, they were becoming more and more plump. Perhaps one day in the future, her face would quietly be comparable to White Fox's. Su Fengnian liked to tease her, bully her, and plot against her. Part of the reason was that it had become a habit. The old god of swords couldn't bear to see Jiang and I being deceived and frightened by this little scoundrel Su Xiaobei. He unhappily said, "Girl, this little bastard is deliberately deceiving you. Ghosts are like immortals. If you believe it, then there is nothing. This old man has traveled Jianghu and seen all kinds of strange people. When it comes to immortals, only old Taoist Qi can count. If Xiangfan really has 100,000 ghosts who don't want to be reincarnated, how can hundreds of thousands of people survive these years?" Su Fengnian chuckled. He didn't mind Li Chuangong's sarcastic way of addressing him. He didn't care much about face. It wasn't something that His Highness was born with. It was something that he was forced to do. He continued to play with the arrow in his hand, whistling leisurely. What made the old god of swords feel defeated was that Su Xiaoshuo's nonsense was obviously more lethal than his earnest and heartfelt advice. Little Zhang's beautiful little face was still pale, as if she was about to run to Wei Shuyang's side with the peach-wood sword in his hand. She had not even reached Xiangfan yet. Jiang and I, who had a deep understanding of ghosts and gods, said fearfully, "Then I won't enter the city. I'll stay on the ship." Helpless, the elderly god of swords could only roll his eyes and sigh. He thought to himself, that little bastard is really little Zhang's nemesis. Su Fengnian laughed and said, "When we reach Xiangfan, we will have to abandon the ship and take the land route. What will you do then? Stay on the ship for the rest of your life? Let me tell you, there are countless water ghosts who died unjustly in the lake. Do you really think that the 10 years of war between Xiangfan and Xiangfan is just a simple siege? Only when the Xiangfan navy is wiped out would there be a siege. In the city, there's still the grand ritual of Zhou set up by the Taoist master of Mount Longhu. What's outside the city?" Jiang and I was speechless. She wanted to cry but had no tears. Old man Li couldn't bear to listen anymore. He rubbed his crotch and planned to walk around the yellow dragon ship. This pair of foes could do whatever they wanted, and he wasn't willing to get involved in their quarrel anymore. Jiang and I asked timidly, "The 36,500 grand ritual of Zhou, set up by the Taoist master of Mount Longhu, is very useful, right?" Su Fengnian glanced at Li Chuangong's back and said playfully, "Of course, the grand ritual of Zhou is the highest ritual in Taoism. Setting up 1,200 altars is already a grand scale. Generally speaking, it's only when something big happens in the emperor's family or the ancestral court of Taoism. The word ritual means the ceremony of pouring wine. To put it simply, it's the Taoist master inviting the celestial beings to drink wine. The grand ritual of Zhou before this dynasty was only set up for the prince with 2,400 celestial beings to pray for blessings and disasters. There's also the 3,600 grand ritual of Zhou for the emperor to protect the country and its people. Xiangfan was founded by the Taoist master's residence. The 36,500 grand ritual of Zhou was unprecedented in history. It's equivalent to inviting all the celestial beings in the heavens. Back then, the Taoist master's residence spent 900,000 taels of silver. If that wasn't enough, the Taoist master's residence would have moved out of Mount Longhu long ago. Jiang and I nodded heavily and clenched his fists. His face relaxed a lot. Unexpectedly, Su Fengnian changed the topic and laughed sinisterly. "But don't forget, just like you said, if the king of Jing'an wanted to deal with me, he would have needed 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers. It's obvious that the more powerful the enemy is, the more extravagant the situation will be. If the ghost city of Xiangfan didn't have any evil spirits that were hard to subdue, why would the dynasty spend so much money?" Jiang and I was scared silly again. Su Fengnian threw the bow and arrow to a Bailiang light cavalry downstairs who was collecting arrows. He walked towards Jiang and I and said in a low voice, "As for me, not only do I have Grandpa Wei's help, I also have many Taoist instruments on me. When we reach Xiangfan, you might as well sleep with me. It's best if we share the same bed, but even if we don't share the same bed, we have to share the same room." Chapter 168. Jiang and I kicked Su Fengnian's knee and angrily cried, "I'd rather be killed by the ghosts than live with you." Su Fengnian bent down and patted his expensive white satin robe. He gave her a thumbs up and smiled. "You have backbone. Su Fengyan pretended to remember something and smiled gently with ulterior motives. Yes, I remember now. The 100,000 wandering souls of Xiang and Fan are mortal enemies with Su Shao, which means that they are my mortal enemies. After you were killed by the wild ghosts, you must have something in common. The more they like you, the more you can't be reincarnated. You can talk about my bad day and night together for 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. The little mudman stared at His Royal Highness, who was the most despicable, sinister, and scoundrel. She choked with sobs and cried until her eyes turned red. Su Fengyan sighed quietly and restrained his expression. He reached out to wipe the tears on the little girl's cheeks. But before Jiang and I turned around, he retracted his hand and said softly, "Little fool, you really believe my nonsense. Think about it, you want to use the talisman to assassinate me. How can the ghosts be willing to kill you? They want you to live a long life to avenge them, right?" Jiang and I nodded blankly, sobbing as she nodded. Su Fengyan turned to look in the direction of Xiangfan. His hands were on his saber. A gentle breeze blew, brushing against his face and sleeves. The crown prince, who had a pair of red phoenix eyes and a red mark on his forehead, looked like an immortal. Su Fengyan whispered to himself, "So what are you afraid of?" "I should be afraid of Xiangfan. You know, I really believe in Buddhism, in the 6 realms of reincarnation, and in karma." Jiang and I wiped the corner of her eyes and asked blankly, "Then why are you still going to Xiangfan?" Su Fengyan smiled. "I'm going to watch the fun. Don't you want to see the 36,500 Zhou Tian ritual?" Jiang and I shook her head. "Not at all." Su Fengyan stretched. "Let's go. It's time for you to read." The books were all on the merchant ship. The two walked down the Yellow Dragon cruise ship one after the other. Su Fengyan said he would jump over her, but she refused. Su Fengyan could only stop the 2 ships and set up a wooden plank between the ships. Su Fengyan let Jiang and I walk first. She walked carefully as if she was walking on thin ice. However, the more one was afraid, the more likely it was to happen. Halfway through, Jiang and I swayed and almost fell into the spring immortal lake. Fortunately, Su Fengyan held her shoulders with both hands. However, she was severely seasick and didn't know how to swim. After stabilizing her body, she didn't dare to move anymore. Su Fengyan didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He could only pick up the strange girl who said she was timid but dared to assassinate him, and said she was bold but didn't dare to take another step. Ignoring her struggles, he walked to the deck of the ship and put her down. As a result, he received a good beating from her. In the cabin, she was gnashing her teeth as she read. Su Fengyan was multitasking. He listened to Jiang and I read while reading the geography of Qingzhou. On the table, there was a map of Xiangfan that Wang Lingquan had specially collected. Just by looking at the drawing, one could tell that it was a majestic city. Over the next few days, the noble ladies of Qingzhou left in 3 groups. Most of them were unwilling to go to Xiang and Fan. Firstly, the ghost city's Yinqi was too heavy. Secondly, they didn't want to be seen by the Jing and palace that they were in the city with Beiliang and His Royal Highness. The oval-faced beauty was the last to leave. For the past few days, she had spent most of her time sipping tea and chatting with His Royal Highness. Her hands had been touched, her feet had been stepped on, her slender waist had been hugged, and her cheeks had been pinched. Fortunately, she was still a virgin. Whether it was fortunate or unfortunate, looking at her expression when she left, it seemed that the latter was more likely. The women of Qingzhou valued fame more than life and death. In the past few years, when they entered the palace for the selection of consorts, this was the prefecture that paid the most attention. If the heir of Beiliang could be hereditary according to the law, there would be 1 Wangfei and 2 secondary Wangfei. Would she really become the Wangfei of the king of Beiliang? Other than the empress, there were only a few Wangfei in the world. At most, there would be the crown prince's consort who could compare. Although Su Fengyan was idle all day long, whether it was teasing the noble ladies of Qingzhou, listening to Jiang Ni's reading, or daydreaming at the bow of the ship at night, he was actually racking his brains to figure out how to swallow the great yellow courtyard in his body. The great yellow courtyard had only absorbed about 20%. The embroidered winter sword in his hand could break the 6 armors. At dusk, They approached Xiang and Fan City. Su Fengyan walked to the deck of the Yellow Dragon ship and suppressed the irritation in his heart. For the past 2 days, he had been receiving news from Wuxia. It was neither good nor bad. One was that the crown prince, who had not been confirmed for a long time, was finally coming to the surface. Another was that the literary, martial, and rouge reviews, which were held once every 10 years, had reappeared. Immortals and demons danced in Jianghu. At the beginning of the martial arts review, it said that there were 3 sects in the world. In Buddhism, there was only Avalokitesvara. In Celestial Way, there was only Ancestor Lu. In Shin Wei, there was only Demon Rinsing Primogenitor. These 3 were the most mixed in the human world and were the closest to the people. Therefore, it was evaluated that the Great Guanyin of the Western regions had entered the 1st rank, Little Ancestor Lu of Dragon Tiger Mountain had entered the 1st rank, and the new chief of Wudong had entered the 1st rank. In the martial arts evaluation, there was a separate sword evaluation. Wudong's sword maniac Wang Xiaoping and sword crown Wu Luding were listed. In the secret letter, Lu Qiu'er said that the Great Guanyin had already left the western regions. Little Ancestor Lu's little celestial master Qi had also left the mountain. Obviously, most of them were coming for Su Fengyan. The capital was in turmoil. All kinds of immortals and demons came one after another. What would Su Fengyan, who was unintentionally standing at the head of the tide, do? Chapter 169. When they arrived at Xiangfan, they could see the famous Jiaoyu platform on the city wall. The Jiaoyu platform had supported the wall for 10 years and a half. On the signboard of the Jiaoyu Tower, there were 4 words, "Alone fishing in the Central Plains." Su Fengyan ignored Wei Wei and Huang Tulang and got off the boat. He rode his horse and galloped towards the ghost city in the twilight. He got off the horse when he was near the city gate. Zhang and I seemed to think that His Royal Highness had a Taoist instrument. He jumped off the carriage and trotted to Su Fengyan's side. Su Fengyan held back his laughter and pointed his embroidered winter knife at the top of the city wall. He squinted his eyes and said, "Do you see that? Back then, the number 1 general in the world guarded there for 10 years. There are not many people who can make Su Xiao grit his teeth. That scholar from West Chu who really read the spring and autumn annals can be ranked in the top 3. Even if your capital of West Chu is destroyed after the Western Wall, even if the whole of Jiangnan falls, this city and this Jiaoyu platform will not fall. Unfortunately, no matter how impregnable Xiangfan is, it can't affect the world." Zhang and I bit his lips. Su Fengyan led the horse and walked slowly. The grain in the city eats the horses. When the horses are exhausted, the sparrows and rats eat the people. Zhang and I was silent. Su Fengyan said softly, "The soldiers knew they would die. The soldiers guarding the city fought to the last man. No one survived. This is the war of the spring and autumn annals. These tragedies are unimaginable to the sharp-tongued people of Shangyin Academy. The walls were made of huge bricks that were specially made in the 3 continents. Each brick had the name of the place where it was made, the supervisor, and the person who made the bricks. When the bricks were laid, the slurry of glutinous rice juice and sorghum juice, as well as lime and tung oil, was poured into the gaps between the bricks. The master craftsman in charge of the construction of the Xiang and Fan cities held a sharp awl. If the awl penetrated even an inch, he would kill the person who built the city and continue the construction. Therefore, the city was as solid as iron. At that time, the historians all called it cruel and cruel. Su Fengyan stopped and did not look at Zhang Ni's face. He said coldly, "When Su Xiao attacked the city, Wang Mingyang defended the city. Both sides prepared for war. This scholar, who used to be a scholar in Jixia, strengthened the defense and moved all the food and materials into the city. Even the houses were demolished and the wood, bricks, and tiles were moved into the city. To prevent Su Xiao from digging a tunnel, he dug 100 wells along the foot of the city and placed large earthen jars covered with leather in the wells so that those with good ears could listen. Not to mention the 50,000 soldiers, he also divided the 150,000 people into different classes. Monks, craftsmen, and paladins each had their own duties. The necessary materials for defending the city were divided into 2 categories, official and civilian. Then, he selected Jianghu people who were good at fighting to patrol the city day and night to prevent spies from setting the city on fire. Wang Mingyang's military skills in the Shangyin Academy had been fully displayed in the past 10 years. Su Xiao once said that if everyone in Shangyin Academy was like this, he could even become a scholar in Jixia. Su Fengyin continued forward. To attack the city, one must first cross the river and cross the trench. Next is the most tragic climbing of the city. Climbing of the city is also known as climbing of ants. Looking at the top of the city, you can imagine the scene of thousands of people climbing up the ladder against arrows, boulders, wood, and oil. It was during this battle that the monks in the city invented the demon-subduing pestle, and the ox-nosed Taoist created the cauldron golden liquid that would fester the moment it touched the skin. In the alley battle after climbing the city, Xiangfan gathered a large number of Jianghu people and heroes who swore to defend this important city for the 3 countries of the Central Plains. It could be said that they were united against a common enemy. Before the alley battle, they had defeated the Beiliang army countless times. If it were not for them, Xiangfan would not have needed 10 years to break the city. 3 years would have been enough. People only knew that Beiliang's army was the best in the world, but they did not know that they were not bad at attacking the city on foot. In the Spring and Autumn War, they were unstoppable. Only in Xiangfan did they lose more than half of their elites, including 300 cave masters who were good at drilling. This attack and defense took 10 years. As for who was right and who was wrong, only heaven knows. However, it was in these 10 years that Su Xiao, who would seek revenge for the smallest grievance, had a real feud with Jianghu. The moat was unusually wide. The drawbridge on the river was not closed. Xiangfan was strictly guarded at night, but the drawbridge had been laid flat all these years. Even the main gate had not been closed for a single night. It seemed that according to the instructions of the celestial master of Mount Longhu, after setting up more than 30,000 great cycle ritual to expiate the sins of the 9 underworlds, the ghost gate was not closed and the wrong souls were allowed to leave Fengdu and Xiangfan. Legend has it that before the celestial master of Mount Longhu left the city, he personally went around the city to draw talismans. In the end, he even hung a Taoist talisman on the top floor of the Jiaoyu Terrace. On it was written, "The heavenly spirits have returned to the heavenly spirits. The earthly spirits should return to the earth." He said that when the wandering souls of Xiangfan dissipated, this talisman would burn up. However, the heavenly talisman had been written for many years and still did not disappear. Without a doubt, it became a haze that could not be removed from the hearts of hundreds of thousands of people in Xiangfan. Su Fengyin led the horse forward. Under his feet were 2 young Kuei. Beside him was Zhang and I, who had a complicated expression. Su Fengyin subconsciously looked at the Jiaoyu Terrace on top of the city wall. The moon was bright and the stars were sparse. The tower was magnificent. Su Fengyin turned his head to the little mudman and said gently, "Don't be afraid." Zhang and I, whose palms were sweaty, lowered his head and grunted. His Royal Highness could not see the person in the tower when he raised his head, but the person in the tower could see Su Fengyin when he lowered his head. The person in the tower had a slender figure. He wore an ordinary Taoist robe and hemp shoes. He wore a Taoist bun with a wooden hairpin and held a horsetail whisk in his hand. The top floor of the Jiaoyu Terrace was a forbidden area. There were several respected old Taoists of Mount Longhu guarding it. Even the king of Jing-en was not allowed to enter. When the great celestial master left the city, he made it clear that only the Taoist master's mansion could set foot on it. If the little girl and the little monk went to the Taoist master's mansion to make trouble, they would recognize this Taoist master. He was the one who led them into the inner courtyard of the Taoist master's mansion. It was he who blocked the attack of the arrogant yellow-purple Taoist master's mansion with his white-tailed horsetail whisk. He also personally introduced him to Mr. White Lotus. This little celestial master of Mount Longhu was surnamed Qi. He had the same surname as the great immortal Qi Xuanzhen and the same appearance as one of the ancestors of Mount Longhu. He held a horsetail whisk in his hand and was praised by the national master who ruled the world as Taigong sits in Kunlun. After he left Mount Longhu, all kinds of rumors snowballed as if the whole world was praising him. However, he was indifferent because he didn't care about these things. To him, these great principles that most people couldn't understand were not principles. In the world, brothers were blind, children were filial, and husband and wife were in love. These were the principles. The great knowledge was just knowledge in the pile of books and classics. They were not knowledge. The old farmers worked hard to farm, the hawkers bargained, and the merchants pursued profits day and night. These were knowledge. He admitted that his Taoist roots were shallow, so he did not seek the way of heaven. He only wanted to enter the world through martial arts and help the world. He left the mountain for two things. The first was to enter Xiangfan. Before his master went into seclusion, he said that the heavenly talisman would burn. He wanted to confirm it with his own eyes. The second was to make a trip to Wudong to confirm whether the young chief could really shoulder the way of heaven. As for how to judge, it was very simple. The horsetail whisk in his hand could be used as a sword. If it could be killed, it was fake. If it could not be killed, it was real. He turned to look at the heavenly talisman that connected the world with a red rope and frowned. The heavenly talisman was shaking. Su Fengyan narrowed his eyes and saw a strange woman walking out of the city gate. She had 33,000 strands of worry on her head. She wore a snow-white monk robe and a white snake was biting on her wrist as a rope. She was barefoot, but her jade-like feet did not cause a speck of dust. She walked lightly on the suspension bridge. Outside the city gate of Xiangfan, the ghost Qi was as heavy as snow and covered the sky and earth. She was the only one who looked like a bodhisattva, transcending all living beings. On the fishing platform, the heavenly talisman burned to ashes. 10,000 ghosts out of the city. The Taoist from the Taoist master's residence side. Mount Longhu has lost. Mount Lantua has won. Chapter 170. The woman's skin was whiter than snow. When such a celestial woman walked out of the ghost gate of Xiangfan, Su Fengyan's horse lowered its head and neighed, its hooves pounding on the ground. Not only this animal, but the entire group of horses were doing the same. The young Kuei's scales stood up under Su Fengyan's feet. Its whole body was scarlet and its face was ferocious, as if it had encountered something dirty. Su Fengyan opened his eyes and looked over. He didn't know if the woman was a celestial or a mortal walking on the suspension bridge. There was no one stepping on the moat, but in an instant, the water was turbulent and boiling, as if thousands of soldiers and horses were passing by. The old god of swords, Li Chungang, showed a serious expression for the first time after leaving Liangzhou. With light steps, he swept in front of Su Fengyan and Jiang and I, standing at the end of the suspension bridge and facing the woman from afar. The white-clothed Guanyin continued to walk forward until she reached the middle of the suspension bridge. The old god of swords stretched out his only arm and took off the dagger talisman. The two of them faced each other. No one saw her move on the suspension bridge, but the moat suddenly exploded. The mirror image of what everyone saw was distorted, and only the white-clothed Guanyin remained clear and independent. Su Fengyan finally saw the woman's beautiful face that seemed to be shrouded by thousands of snowy mountains. He was stunned. The woman was as beautiful as a painting, and he knew who she was. Monk Long Shou, who claimed to be from Mount Lantua, said that he wanted to bring him to the western region. This monk in red robes and cassock was very otherworldly, so Su Fengyan specially went to the Tide Listening Pavilion to read the secret scriptures. The woman in front of him was the top Buddhist figure list, the master of the Red Sect of Tantric Buddhism. She had a long list of titles such as Great Compassion Dharma King, Bodhisattva Mending Acupoint, Master of Six Jewels. She was an old woman in her 40s. Su Fengyan thought that she was already old, and even if she had the skill to retain her youth, she would not be that pure and youthful. However, the woman in front of him was a little too tall, and her face was no different from a woman in her 20s. Her eyes were compassionate, and she was born with a red mole in the middle of her forehead. Su Fengyan thought that if he had known that the master of Mount Lantua was so beautiful, he would have bargained with her. Dual cultivation? No problem. As long as the master was willing to leave the western region, Liangzhou's environment. His Royal Highness had mountains of gold and silver mountains. Would he lack of a bed? Su Fengyan calmed himself down and stood side by side with Li Chungang. He said softly, "This person is the Dharma King of Mount Laotua, also known as the Bodhisattva of 6 Pearls. It is said that she has Avalokitesvara Guru, Lotus King Guru, and Wrath Vajra Guru. Can you defeat her?" The old god of swords held the divine talisman with one arm and was all smiles. If he didn't know the identity of the old man in the sheepskin coat, he would have mistaken him for an old fellow who didn't respect himself and was blocking his way to take advantage of his beauty. Li Chungang lowered his head and spat out a mouthful of green gang qi that Su Fengyan could see with the naked eye. It wrapped around the priceless divine talisman and shone brilliantly in the night. The old man said softly, "The monks of Mount Lantua are known to be unkillable. Back then, the red-armored man fought with an old man with a pestle for 3 days and 3 nights. Neither of them could kill the other. The Vajra state of the first order came from the Buddhism sect. This old man would like to see if he really has the Vajra body. However, it's unfair to fight with a little girl of the younger generation." Su Fengyan, who wished for the world to be in chaos, said, "The old god of swords is only holding a dagger. He's already conserving his strength and not bullying the younger generation." The cross-eyed old man glanced at His Highness the Crown Prince, who didn't want to settle the matter peacefully and only wanted to watch the battle from the sidelines. The corners of his mouth twitched, but he didn't mind. The reason why people couldn't make a name for themselves in swordsmanship was because they couldn't break 10,000 techniques with one sword. When fighting with others, they were afraid of this and that. They were so afraid that they would lose their swordsmanship in the end. Li Chungang was not willing to pay attention to Su Fengyan's narrow-mindedness. From Beiliang to Qingzhou and then to Shangfan, he had been observing this Beiliang heir. The conclusion he came to was that this kid's talent in martial arts was not bad. He was determined to be ruthless. It was a pity that he started martial arts too late. Otherwise, he might have become a Chao Guanzi before he turned 30. The white-clothed Guanyin took another step forward and Li Chungang was about to attack with a green dragon. But she was only 1 step away. She stopped on the drawbridge. She did not look at the old god of swords, who was a potential enemy, but at the slowly retreating Su Fengyan. She raised her hand. The old god of swords, whose name was Sword Gang, had a talisman in his hand like a green snake. His gang qi was like a green snake spitting out its tongue. A gust of green gas gushed out and his entire arm was surrounded by green gas. But this female Dharmaraja, who was born in the imperial family of central India and was born on Mount Lantua, only raised her hand to lift the pot, uncorked it, and drank a mouthful of wine. The wine was not familiar with the old god of swords gang qi, so much so that the entire drawbridge was filled with its fragrance. The little white snake coiled around her white arm. It was an extremely strange scene. This 6-jewel bodhisattva glanced at Su Fengyan. With just a glance, Su Fengyan's great yellow courtyard surged like a tidal wave and he spat out a mouthful of blood. The retainers behind him were shocked and were about to step forward to protect him when Su Fengyan stopped them with a wave of his hand. After spitting out a mouthful of blood, Su Fengyan's chest was not stuffy but clear. "Second heaven and third heaven? If I take a few more glances, won't the great yellow courtyard be in my body?" Sure enough, she looked again. Just as Su Fengyan was dumbfounded, the old god of swords frowned and shouted softly. A wisp of green gang qi appeared on the drawbridge and seemed to sever the formless qi. He glared at Su Fengyan and said, "Brat, you don't know what's good for you. Do you really think she's a compassionate bodhisattva just because you gave her some benefits? Be careful, you won't even know how you died." The white-clothed Guanyin shook her head slightly, put away the wine pot, and walked forward silently. "Brat, you and Jiang Las retreat." With that, the old god of swords stomped his foot. With the sole of his foot as the epicenter, a deafening ripple of dust appeared. Su Fengyan pulled Jiang and I and floated backward. The spotless female Dharmaraja ignored the formless sword qi from the old god of swords and walked forward barefoot. Just as the sword qi was about to reach him, a big monk in a red kasaya appeared between the old god of swords and the white-clothed Guanyin on the bridge. He had a wooden expression and managed to block the rings of sword qi. His kasaya fluttered in the wind as he stood tall. Su Fengyan sighed quietly. This monk, Long Shou, who had said that he would wait for 31 years, had appeared. If it was just a 6-jeweled Dharmaraja, Su Fengyan believed that with Li Chuangong's strength and the second-rank retainers behind him, it would not be impossible for them to trap this Guanyin of Mount Lantua, let alone kill her. Although the red-clothed monk was not a first-rank Dharmaraja, in this delicate situation, he was the biggest variable. Moreover, Su Fengyan did not have any ill feelings towards the monk in front of him. He had always respected eminent monks who had achieved the Tao. If they really fought to the death, regardless of the outcome, it would not be a pleasant thing to watch. The red-clothed monk put his palms together and bowed his head. My master has entered the world without any intention of fighting. I hope that His Royal Highness will not blame him. My master has come out of Xiangfan to release 100,000 evil spirits from purgatory. He has accumulated immeasurable merit for His Royal Highness. Su Fengyan felt that these words were preposterous, but he believed them without a doubt. Both Buddhism and Taoism had recorded that there were 100,000 evil spirits in Xiangfan who had been cooked by their relatives. Their resentment was so great that even the 36,500 grand ritual of the cycle could not eliminate them. Thus, the two sects made an unwritten bet that whoever won would enter Xiangfan and whoever lost would leave Xiangfan. This would not change for 100 years. If Mount Longhu won, the two Zen temples and the monks of Mount Lantua would not be able to set foot in Xiangfan for 100 years. If they lost, Mount Longhu would have to withdraw the grand ritual of the cycle and move out of their Taoist temples. They would not be able to preach in the city. The disputes between the three sects and the sects for fame and fortune were actually childish and unreasonable. Zhang and I muttered, "She's so beautiful. She looks like Goddess Guanyin." Su Fengyan smiled bitterly. Goddess Guanyin observes the sounds of all living beings in the world. Ordinary people can be liberated by listening to her sounds. The goddess Guanyin in the eyes of the little clay figurine first brushed past Li Chungang at the bridgehead. She then brushed past His Royal Highness and said softly in Sanskrit, "I'm Guanyin. You're uncomfortable. You're not worthy of dual cultivation." Su Fengyan did not know why, but he laughed and said, "Since I'm uncomfortable, may I ask Bodhisattva to be at ease?" ###tomorrow update as the title. Recommended a few books and cartoons. Crossing the South and Returning to the North. 13 lectures on ancient poetry. The unnatural death of China's literati. The Queen of Arms was a female protagonist. The world of acceleration was a pig's horn. Chapter 171. After Su Fengyan finished speaking, he noticed that Guanyin Bodhisattva beside him was a head taller than him. She was walking barefoot. Su Fengyan's height was already outstanding. Most of the men in the cold lands were tall and sturdy, but Su Fengyan did not appear short at all. Coming to Jiangnan, he appeared even more slender. Among the women beside him, Jiang and I was still growing. Tall women like Yu Yue and Shu Xiu were half a head shorter than him, but the female Dharmaraja was even taller than His Royal Highness. Not to mention how unconventional her clothing and temperament were. Just her height alone was rather eye-catching. After the two brushed past each other, Su Fengyan very ungracefully turned his head to stare at the Dharmaraja of Mount Lantua. The wooden-faced monk Long Shou once again put his palms together, greeting His Royal Highness alone. The two had met twice in Beiliang. In addition, although Su Fengyan had a bad reputation, he was close to Su Fengyan. Everyone in Beiliang knew this, so the monk Long Shou did not dislike Su Fengyan. The red-clothed monk threw a peach at him, and Su Fengyan returned the favor by nodding his head slightly. Because of Wang Fei's worship of Buddhism, Su Fengyan loved the house and its crow. He was well-versed in many Buddhist sections. This was not to belittle the principles of Taoism. He still agreed that the roots of the Central Plains were in Taoism. It was just that he had been exposed to the enmity between Su Xiao and Taoism since he was young. It was inevitable that he would have some opinions about some Taoist figures. In fact, Buddhism had always been called the Western religion by the scholars of the Central Plains. It was a very derogatory term. After the War of the Spring and Autumn Kingdom, the remnants of the fallen countries that did not care about fame and fortune in the early days all hid from the world. Once they chose Buddhism, they were widely criticized by the people. They were called escape from Zen because of the fear of death, and cursed that the old monks' true colors were excellent. However, as the current emperor began to worship Buddhism, their views changed. There were no less than 10,000 wandering monks in the capital alone, but Buddhism did not have a leader. It was not as clear-cut as the Taoism of Mount Longhu. The black-clothed old monk Yang Taisui was the imperial tutor of 2 dynasties. He had enough skills and experience and was the best candidate to be the leader of Buddhism. Unfortunately, the sickly old monk was a rootless duckweed. He had even severed ties with his family early on. Even when he taught the sons and grandsons of the emperor, he would keep a straight face. It was rumored that he had broken a few feather dusters in the inner palace. The princes and princesses were all very afraid of this old monk. In the palace, Princess Sui Zhu was the most domineering. Even the fearless one said that she was only afraid of black rice crust. In addition, the black-clothed old monk had been refusing visitors for more than a decade. If he did not form a faction and was alone, how could he have any power? The white-clothed Guanyin fluttered away, turning a deaf ear to Su Fengyan's shameless request for freedom. Once she left, monk Longsho, who had been willing to wait for 30 years, no longer had any reason to draw a circle on the ground and follow her back to Mount Lantua. Other than the 2 Zen temples, the monks all wanted to say that they came from Mount Lantua, but none of them actually went to Mount Lantua. Su Fengyan caught a glimpse of Jiang and I, who was staring at the back of the female Dharmaraja with a blank expression. He could not help but tease. "You want to go to Mount Lantua with me? You want to be a concubine or a nun? Let me tell you in advance, eating vegetarian food and praying to Buddha is much more difficult than studying to earn money." Li Chungang, who had gently tucked the divine talisman back into his hair bun, said playfully, "This woman from Mount Lantua has the intention of practicing dual cultivation with you?" Su Fengyan said regretfully, "In the past, I was afraid that she would be an old cow eating young grass, so I refused her no matter what. Now it's her turn to despise me. What a world." The old god of swords finally had a chance to make a dig at Su Fengyan, so he naturally would not miss it. He said sarcastically, "Young Su," she said in front of a large group of people, "that you are not worthy of practicing dual cultivation. You are the great king of Bailiang, and his royal highness. How can you tolerate that? Won't you be the laughing stock of the world if this gets out?" Su Fengyan said, "It's best if they laugh to death. I don't even need to learn the sword anymore. If I see someone I don't like, I'll tell them this joke. They'll die of laughter after hearing it." Old man Li was stunned. Jiang and I, who had finally regained his senses, heard such shameless words and said angrily, "You're really shameless." Su Fengyan said helplessly, "Then can you give me a way to save my face? Let 100 people rush up and beat up this goddess Guanyin? Or kneel on the ground and beg her to practice dual cultivation with me?" The little clay figurine was in a good mood after seeing Su Fengyan being looked down upon by the goddess in her heart. She turned around and repeated with a smile, "Not worthy, not worthy, not worthy." Su Fengyan purposely distanced himself from Jiang and I. He looked at the city wall and sighed. "Tonight is a good day for 100,000 wild ghosts to come out of the city." Jiang and I immediately shut up and subconsciously walked closer to Su Fengyan. Su Fengyan took the lead and walked up the suspension bridge. Xiangfan was a typical majestic city in military books. The outer edge of the city was built with a protruding horseface. Su Fengyan walked past the moat and thought about the first attack and defense of the country war years ago. He could not help but remember the Trojan bull during the siege. He turned around and asked the old god of swords behind him, "What's the origin of the name Trojan bull?" Su Fengyan seemed to realize that this question was inappropriate after he asked it. To a swordsman, having his sword broken was undoubtedly the greatest humiliation in his life. Moreover, it was broken by 2 of Wang Xianji's fingers. He did not expect old man Li to be so nonchalant. He only nodded calmly and said, "The name Trojan bull indeed came from the siege weapon that you guessed. It means that all the enemies in the world are cities. There's no city that Trojan bull can't break. The forging of Trojan bull and the divine talisman are no different. They both came from a piece of flying rock. The previous emperor sent people overseas to visit immortals. They happened to encounter a flying rock that fell into the sea and caused 1,000 waves. They fished it up from the bottom of the sea. Half of it was used to forge the Trojan bull and the other half to create the red armor of the talisman general. The remaining essence was used to create the divine talisman dagger on this old man's head. Su Fengyan teased. Then you and the little clay figurine are really fated. The old god of swords chuckled. Chapter 172. The city was strictly guarded at night, but that was only for normal people. For Su Fengyan, a top nobleman who dared to fight with the Qingzhou Navy, as well as a deity from Mount Lantua, he could come and go as he pleased. The guards at the gate had most likely received instructions from the king of Jing and Zhaoheng, and did not stop him. Otherwise, if they met, it would just be giving face to Su Fengyan. They could not hope to make the crown prince of Beiliang suffer in such a small matter. Even now, no one could say that Su Fengyan would be punished for the farce at the Spring Deity Lake. After all, it was different from the past. Right now, the king of Beiliang, dressed in a blue satin robe with 9 dragons, was in the capital. For the first time in the morning court session in the Golden Imperial Palace, this king with a different surname carried a sword as he ascended the throne. Faced with the censure of several officials, other than Zhang Julu, Gu Jiantang, and the 3 grand secretaries of the palace, Ren Tu only stood there and dozed off, ignoring all of them. As for whether or not there was fear behind his anger, no one knew. There were rumors in the capital that the king of Beiliang and his cavalry were resting at the Zaimawi Inn, which was deserted. Everyone in the capital was delighted and applauded. They all said that this was the will of the heavens, and that the unjust will find little help. The fate of Beiliang had come to an end. The Zaimawi Inn was truly deserted. In the inner courtyard, the king of Beiliang, dressed in the garb of a rich man, was drinking green ant wine with an old monk in black. The wine was something that Su Xiao had specially brought from Liangzhou to Great and City. The old man in front of him, nicknamed the Sickly Tiger, had been forcefully dragged over by Su Xiao. In fact, over the years, the green ant wine had been sold in the capital because of his second daughter, Su Weisheng's brother appreciating the snow. However, the king of Beiliang had personally brought the strong wine for thousands of li. The gift was light, but the affection was great. This could be considered a way for Su Xiao to express his attitude to an old friend in a foreign land. You, Yang Taisui, did not treat me as a friend. Even when I entered the city, you had to keep an eye on me for the emperor. However, Su Xiao still treated you, old bald donkey, as a friend. That year, you treated me as a farewell. The spring chill in the capital had long been eliminated, and the chirping of cicadas did not stop. However, Su Xiao still seemed to be afraid of the cold. He raised his hand and exhaled. He sighed and said, "When I left the capital, I remembered that the dynasty had 1,864 post-house stations. Now that so many countries have been annexed, can there still be half left?" The black-robed old monk said calmly, "Great Peace City, Great Peace City. The world is at peace and stability. Why is there a need to recreate the scene of the past when there were so many posts and messages flying everywhere? Isn't that a good thing?" Everyone knew that Su Xiao had an inseparable feeling for the post house because the Liang dynasty did not attach much importance to the construction of the post house back then. After Su Xiao took control of the military power, he proposed 10 policies. Among them, the post house and horse policy were developed to the greatest extent in his hands. There were also a few policies that had died midway before they could be popularized because of the end of the spring and autumn period. The elimination of the post house was just a miniature version. When the Liang dynasty was at its peak, it was like passing one relay station after another. The relay stations were like fish scales. Ride after ride, the relay horses were like shooting stars. Therefore, when the war of the country ended, almost all the emperors of the fallen countries were escorted to Great Peace City. During this time, when they saw a relay station 30 li away, they were all shocked by Su Xiao's methods. Many famous generals who only complained about the timing and location after losing the war were finally convinced. Because a small relay station involved many things such as the relay route, each of them was extremely troublesome. Just the planting and maintenance of the plants on both sides of the relay route alone cost the national treasury a lot of silver every year. At that time, the war was in full swing. Not to mention the incapable emperors, the wise emperors only focused on the training of armor. They wanted to spend money today so they could see results tomorrow. As an official, how could they be like Su Xiao and persuade the emperor to spend money on a 100-year plan? Su Xiao smiled. Of course it is a good thing in the short term. After 100 years, it will be hard to say if it will be a good thing. The old monk in black was a monk, but he also drank wine. He took a sip and said calmly, "You don't have to worry." Su Xiao laughed involuntarily. "I'm not a monk like you. If I don't worry, how can I face the heroes who fought with me in the past? Who won this world?" Yang Taisui frowned and said, "Zhang Julu will worry. Gu Jiantang will also worry. Also, so what if you helped the late emperor win the world? Without you, lame Su, there would be lame Li and lame Wang. You were proud of your achievements, but the late emperor didn't get rid of the hound after the rabbit was killed. He still allowed you to be the king of Beiliang. Isn't that enough?" Su Xiao said softly, "It's enough. That's why I didn't do anything after you pulled me to drink. The favor I owed you and him back then has been repaid." At this point, the old monk in black felt guilty and stopped talking. His expression was slightly lonely. When that woman first entered the world, the sword case only had 9 words carved on it. "This sword pacifies the injustices of the world." When the late emperor learned of this, he smiled and said that without this sister-in-law, there would be no Su Xiao, and there wouldn't be his great country. The dragon sparrow sword of Deliang was worthy of these 9 words. That extraordinary woman only carved the last 9 words before she died. Every time the old monk in black thought of it, he felt guilty because he was the most guilty person in the world. The old monk asked, "Then why did you still invite me to drink?" Su Xiao snorted and said, "If it weren't for my wife persuading me all those years after I came to Beiliang, saying that a bald donkey like me had difficulties, I wouldn't have bothered with you no matter how magnanimous I am." Yang Taisui smiled bitterly. Su Xiao drank a mouthful of wine and sneered, "In the next court assembly, if Gu Jiantang dares to instigate a bunch of bastards to use underhanded tricks, don't blame me for pulling out my blade and hacking him." Yang Taisui frowned and said, "Even if Gu Jiantang is empty-handed, you can't beat him. He's the #1 sword user in the world." Su Xiao asked in return, "If I hack him, he dares to retaliate. Back then, when I beheaded his direct descendant and hung him on the city wall, he dares to stop me? He didn't dare back then, and now that he's getting older and older, he dares even less." The old monk in black chuckled and said, "Seems like he doesn't dare." Su Xiao smiled and said, "Isn't that so? How was this the king of Beiliang wearing a 5-clawed python robe? He was clearly a scoundrel in the marketplace. No wonder he could raise such an unscrupulous son like Su Fengnian." Su Xiao smiled and asked, "If I really hack Gu Jiantang to death, what will you do this time?" Yang Taisui said calmly, "I've already repaid the loyalty and righteousness I owe back then. Since you can invite me to drink today, I can invite you to kill someone and leave the capital tomorrow." Su Xiao laughed and said, "You bald donkey, at least you still have some conscience." The old monk in black remained silent. No one in the world was more trustworthy than this sickly tiger. The pot of green ants was quickly emptied. The old monk said softly, "You've caused the princess to live uncomfortably in the past, and now you've implicated your children, especially that Su Fengnian. Don't you feel any guilt?" Su Xiao smiled calmly and said, "We're not a family. Once you enter a family, you won't eat a family meal. What's there to live uncomfortably? It's all fate." The old monk sighed. Su Xiao asked, "Do you know about the 6 jewels guru of Mount Lantua?" The old monk nodded and said, "When this person first started cultivating, he didn't talk to the outside world. Unlike the rest of the world, he achieved the great moksha state of motion and stillness early on. He's a great sage in Buddhism. He leaped into the 8 jewels realm at the same time as the new chief of Mount Wudong. They're both rare bodhisattvas of flesh." Su Xiao nodded and frowned. The old monk asked, "I heard that this red sex Dharma king went to Shangfan. Aren't you worried?" Su Xiao muttered, How can I not be worried? She's dual cultivating with Fengyan. I'm worried, but not dual cultivating. I'm even more worried. Chapter 173. It had already been 10 days since the king of Bailiang, Su Xiao, had arrived in the capital. In these 10 days, Su Xiao had not paid a visit to anyone, nor had anyone come to the Damayai courier station to present their name. Logically speaking, as a king with a different surname, Su Xiao should not be restricted by the rules and regulations of the clan and vassal law. Of the tens of thousands of officials in the capital, it would be best for them to curry favor with those in power. Even on the day when the results were released, quite a few officials would use the pretense of being from the same hometown to get close to those new grand scholars. Why was it that, when it came to Su Xiao's side, not a single one of them showed up? In truth, with just a bit of thought, it was clear. In the imperial court, Grand Secretary Zhang led the civil officials, Gu Jiantang led the military generals, and the Green faction formed their own faction and roped in a group of stragglers. The remaining elders of the 8 perished countries supported each other, so it could still be considered a clear division. However, as the second generation of remaining young masters gradually rose to prominence, the earlier hostility and antagonism began to fade, and they began to integrate into the earlier tripartite balance of power. Among the 8 old countries, there were splits. Western Shu was the closest to Qingzhou, so most of them were absorbed by the Green faction. Many scholars in Western Chu naturally had a favorable impression of the current Grand Secretary Zhang Julu, who hailed from the Great Yellow Sect. As for the valiant Dongyue and other barbarian lands, they preferred Great General Gu Jiantang. The latter also felt that this group of youngsters who could ride a saber and spear, as well as write poetry and literature, was more to his liking. As a result, the old Grand Secretary and the other pillars of the country of the older generation did not see eye to eye with Su Xiao. The new generation of popular officials, influenced by their ancestors and the Spring and Autumn War, would not take the initiative to side with the remote king of Bailiang. Most of them were divided between the 4 factions on the surface. Of course, if the pillar of Bailiang took the initiative to favor them, it was likely that no one would refuse this enormous honor. Hadn't the minor official of Yongzhou, Jean Lanting, relied on a letter of recommendation from the pillar of Bailiang to become an extremely noble member of the Great Yellow Sect? Su Xiao was not late for today's morning court session. When he stepped out of the carriage, he was already wearing a blue satin robe embroidered with dragons. In the past, it had always been Grand Secretary Zhang Julu who was the earliest to enter, and Great General Gu, who had always been the last to enter, and no one daring to overstep. Apart from this, as for who would be the second and third to enter the palace, it wasn't too particular. Generally speaking, it should be based on seniority and rank. However, as the struggle between the factions in the court grew increasingly intense, it became increasingly unruly. The Gu faction was mostly martial artists, and they looked down on the remnants of defeated and perished countries. They also didn't have much respect for the Green faction. The Zhang faction, which had the most influence, had always been gentle and respectful. If the 4 factions were to include the 2 variables of the foreign relatives and eunuchs, in general, it was truly a chaotic and endless entanglement. In today's court session, most of the officials learned that Great General Gu had gone to the Liao 2 days ago and was destined not to return in a short amount of time. This made many of the spectators who were looking forward to the 2 famous generals of the spring and autumn period fighting fiercely in Baohe Palace feel extremely disappointed. Perhaps because the group of tigers had no leader, the Gu faction, who were originally used to being unreasonable and fighting to enter the palace, was extremely low-key today, not in a rush to pass South Tianmen. They only eyed the old cripple in the blue satin robe covetously. The Gu faction didn't make a move. The Zhang faction, because Grand Secretary Zhang stood at the door with his hands in his sleeves, as if waiting for someone, also didn't enter the palace. Known as Zhang faction's trusted civil official and conscience, the newly promoted Wuying Palace scholar Wen Shouxin stood next to the Grand Secretary. His forehead was covered in sweat, because the Grand Secretary didn't enter the palace. In front of him, a hunchbacked old man was currently walking over. The embroidered robe, Su Xiao chuckled and asked, "Scholar One, why aren't you carrying a coffin to court today?" When Shouxin still had some courage and insight, with a heavy cold snort, He didn't pay any attention to the mockery and ridicule. Earlier, he had his old servant carry a coffin to court to ask for death, impeaching the king of Bailiang, Su Xiao, for the 10 great capital crimes, begging the emperor to pay with his life, only asking for Su Xiao's death. It could be said to be a magnificent feat which of the officials and common people of the capital didn't raise a thumb. Originally, some of the colleagues within the Zhang faction who had been silently criticizing him for being promoted to Wuying Palace Scholar also became completely silent, tacitly agreeing with Grand Secretary Zhang's arrangements. The Zhang faction's influence was the most profound and vast, so if they lost anyone, they wouldn't lack anyone. As a result, the internal strife was often the fiercest. Zhang Julu surprisingly didn't care too much about this type of internal strife. As long as it didn't touch his bottom line, he never interfered. During these years, only a few people were expelled from the Zhang faction, their fates all dismal. If they weren't banished to the border, then they would never be employed again. When Su Xiao saw that this Wuying Palace Scholar was pretending to be deaf and mute, he patted his shoulder, saying with an amiable laugh, "The imperial court needs loyal and righteous subjects like you. I heard that when Scholar 1 was a county official, his sleeves were clean and his hands were clean to the extreme, even starving 2 of his daughters to death. When I first heard this news in Bailiang, I was already bewildered. How could this type of official only be an 8th-rank minor official? This is our Grand Secretary Zhang's mistake. Who would have thought that in just a few years, after Scholar Wen's 2 daughters died, in the blink of an eye, he would become a Wuying Palace Scholar? What rank does he rank among the 3 halls and 3 pavilions? It seems like Scholar 1 should still have a few fewer daughters. If he had 2 more, wouldn't Grand Secretary Zhang have nothing to do with it? Forget about Wuying Palace Scholar. Even that Preservation Palace Scholar would similarly be in Wendaren's bag. However, it's hard to say if Grand Secretary Zhang doesn't have many teachers. Just the death of an old Grand Secretary. Yet he already has his current glory, when Darren still can't compare. Doesn't this mean that you 2 Darren are both profiting from the dead? Ha, these words are nonsense. The 2 Darren are both magnanimous prime ministers. Please don't take it to heart. When Shoshin's face flushed completely red, he wanted to curse out, but he didn't dare, feeling extremely sullen. There were a lot of Zhang faction officials who pretended to be angry, but there weren't actually that many who were truly angry. To the side, Grand Secretary Zhang Julu was over 50 years old, but he didn't look old. This current number 1 person's appearance was especially praised by others, with a purple beard and blue eyes, extremely imposing. When he was young, he was nicknamed Blue Eyes. When he worked as an aide for the old Grand Secretary, he was greatly valued. However, the old Grand Secretary was patient, willing to spend 30 years to carve this piece of unpolished jade. He didn't pull up seedlings to help them grow, refusing several promotions in the bureaucracy on behalf of his beloved disciple, to the extent where he didn't even care about the opportunity to be sent out to become a border official. Meanwhile, Zhang Julu was even more patient, spending 30 years of his life in the imperial family, neither arrogant nor impetuous, always patiently watching the court's political affairs with the cold eye of a bystander, only watching and listening, the only thing he didn't say. As soon as he left the imperial family, he became a dragon. Within 2 years after his respected teacher's death, he continuously rose 11 levels, taking over the old Grand Secretary's empty position, so much so that his position of authority even surpassed the old Grand Secretary's. Zhang Julu was ridiculed by Su Xiao, but he didn't show the slightest bit of abnormality. With an expressionless face, he said, Yang Guosher once said that if you have Buddha in your heart, you will see everyone as Buddha. If you have feces in your heart, you will see everything as feces. It is said that De Zhugua was also present when Yang Guosher said this. I don't know if De Zhugua heard it in his ears or in his heart. Su Xiao laughed out loud and said, Whatever Yang Taisui said, no matter what you all think, except for the good things he said about me, I'll just treat it as bullshit. Zhang Julu dismissed it with a light laugh. The main buildings behind the imperial city's south gate were the 3 outer court halls and the 9 inner court halls. Among the 3 halls, the Palace of Preserving Peace was the most expensive. The common people in the marketplace called it the Hall of Golden Imperial Audience. They thought that all court meetings were held there, but that wasn't the case. The Palace of Preserving Peace was usually used for all kinds of major ceremonies. His Majesty would usually hold court in the Tianqian Palace or the Hall of Cultivation Spirit. It was probably to show his respect to the king of Bailiang, Su Shao, that the 2 morning court meetings were held in the Palace of Preserving Peace. The roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace had a total of 18,000 dragon patterns. The roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace, the roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace, the roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace, the roof of the Palace of Preserving Peace. This was only the scale of the Palace of Preserving Peace. Spread out, the number of dragon patterns in the imperial city was innumerable. The huge platform of the Palace of Preserving Peace had the character Earth, facing the south. Starting from the south of the imperial city, the central axis of the Palace of Preserving Peace, the 3 halls were lined up in a row. Not a single tree was planted. To meet the Son of Heaven, the imperial road was long. The eunuchs and imperial bodyguards were hidden in the shadows of the strictly guarded buildings on both sides of the road. It was as if they were the only ones walking in the world. Therefore, when the blood-soaked Su Shao met the emperor for the first time, he was counting the number of steps to dispel his fear. If Su Shao was like this, it was needless to say that the other courtiers who attended court for the first time were trembling with fear. Accompanying the monarch was like accompanying a tiger, especially since the 2 successive emperors of the dynasty were both heroes and great strategists. The monarch's scheming had reached the peak of perfection. No one dared to say that they were familiar with figuring out the emperor's will. This made the courtiers feel as if they were walking on thin ice. Today, the blue-eyed Zhang intended to let Su Shao be the first to attend court. Su Shao also did not decline his responsibility and took the lead to walk through the towering palace gate. It seemed that other than Zhang, everyone had forgotten that as long as the Palace of Preserving Peace's Grand Secretary was empty, the civil officials had to respect the Great Pillar State as their leader. Chapter 174. Ever since Wudong's old chief, Wang Zhongluo, passed away, the incense that was already not much had decreased by a bit. Fortunately, the close to 1,000 old Taoists, middle-aged chancellor, and Taoist children behind the memorial arch were used to living a poor life. When the house leaks, it will be repaired. When the clothes are old, it will be repaired. When the clothes are old, it will be repaired. When the house leaks, it will be repaired. When the clothes are old, it will be repaired. When the house leaks, it will be repaired. When the house leaks, it will be repaired. When the clothes are old, it will be repaired. At this time, a young Taoist was squatting behind the memorial arch of Black Tortoise Dongxing and sighing. Beside him were a few mischievous Taoist children from the nearby Taoist temple. Each and every one of them were fighting over this Taoist priest to tell them some love stories from the book. This story was much more interesting than the Taoist scriptures, but it was a bit too desolate. Why didn't the men and women in the story have a good ending? Listening to the storyteller beside him nearing the end of the story, he became more and more worried. Didn't they force themselves to be beaten by their master with a plank to escape from the Taoist lesson and sneak out? Grand Marshal Granduncle, why are there so many riddles, drinking games, and poems in this book? Don't tell me they were all thought up by one person. If it's true, how much knowledge does the person who wrote this book have? Isn't he almost comparable to Grand Marshal Granduncle? A little Taoist child who had only been on Wudong Mountain for less than 2 years asked timidly. The little Taoist child was born with red lips and white teeth. He was full of vigor. Propping his cheeks with both hands, he stared at his master's martial uncle. According to reason, he should be calling him Chief. However, it seemed that everyone in the book did not like this Grand Marshal Granduncle, so he still called him Chief according to seniority. Nonsense. How can the person who wrote this book be more knowledgeable than Grand Marshal Granduncle? A little Taoist child who had entered the mountain a little earlier slapped the little Taoist child with a stern expression. The little Taoist child who was scolded held his head and did not dare to refute. I'm not talking nonsense. If the person who wrote this book and I were to debate about Taoist principles, I reckon he would not be able to win. However, when it comes to love and affection, I am 108,000 li away. This is the principle of specialization. In the future, when you study scriptures with your masters and encounter problems, don't think that your masters are always right. If I still say that you are wrong and you are still unconvinced, you can go down the mountain to find out who is right and who is wrong. If one day you feel that you have found the answer and that I and my masters were wrong, you can return to the mountain and tell us that we were really wrong. If you feel that you were wrong, don't feel ashamed. Remember that our Wudong mountain gate will never be closed. The young Taoist smiled and rubbed the head of the youngest Taoist. His smile was warm. Grand Marshal Granduncle, I think it's wrong for Master to hit us whenever he's unhappy. What do you think? The little Taoist asked innocently. The young Taoist laughed softly and said, When I was young, I was also hit a few times. However, now I know that most of the time it was my own fault. After a while, I no longer care about it. Master and senior brothers are not saints without temper. It's inevitable that they will make some mistakes. In Wudong's 1,000 years of history, there are hundreds of thousands of recorded Taoists. However, there is only one statue of Xuanwu Tianzuan. We, including me, are all ordinary people. We have to allow others to make mistakes and allow ourselves to make mistakes. Don't be stubborn. Otherwise, we will not be happy. It's not easy for us to come to the world. If we are always angry, even if you are a high and mighty emperor, it will be boring. Moreover, we are born in the world. Glory, splendor, wealth and status are nothing more than passing clouds. The Tao is made of gold and the medicinal pill furnace is filled with spring. Wudong is my pillow and my pillow is Wudong. That is enough. A slightly older Taoist whispered, Marshal Granduncle, I heard that rich people eat meat every day. I am so greedy. When I am hungry and recite scriptures, I always drool when I think about it. The most handsome young Taoist with the highest seniority smiled and said, Isn't eating meat every day the same as eating plain tea every day? Qing Feng, Marshal Granduncle, gave you 10 steamed buns. You were the first to taste it. How does the 10th steamed bun taste? The young Taoist named Qing Feng said with a bitter face, 10 steamed buns. I am stuffed to death. The young Marshal Granduncle laughed and said, That's right. It is the same principle on the mountain. Senior brother sect leader said that it is better to have a high heart than a high Tao. If we are greedy, there will be no end. Before Ancestor Lu ascended to immortality, he hung a sword on Nangong Yuejiao's head. Do you know what is the most powerful part of that sword? I heard from Master that the sword can fly for 1,000 miles. It must be to slay demons and eliminate devils. The young Marshal Granduncle listened with a smile and did not say anything. When it was quiet, he said softly, Ancestor Lu seemed to have left behind the 3-foot sword, but in reality, he left behind the Tao root and Wudong. He taught us to use the Qing Feng sword to cut away worries, greed, anger, and lust. Lust. The youngest Taoist child was confused. The rest of the young Taoist priests who didn't know much were all chuckling. The book I read is called The First Snow in the East Wing. It skipped some things about men and women. The young Marshal Granduncle said with a smile. Does Grand Marshal Granduncle have lust? The little guy asked. Without waiting for the Marshal Granduncle to reply, the little guy was beaten up by the senior brothers and junior uncles. The young Marshal Granduncle rubbed his little head again and said softly, Yes. There was a burst of surprised gasps. But no one thought that the self-proclaimed Wudong Mountain's young ancestor who claimed to have lust was not lofty, learned, or amiable. The young Marshal Granduncle laughed and said, It is not a bad thing to know that you are not good. This is the same as us Taoists seeking the Tao of heaven. You know that it is not in my hands, so you want to seek the Tao. Marshal Granduncle, you still haven't sought the Tao? A young Taoist asked nervously. It is hard to say. The young Marshal Granduncle said honestly. At this time, a group of old pilgrims from Yongzhou finally walked more than 10 li of the divine path. Panting for breath, they arrived under the memorial arch. The young Taoist immediately stood up and called the young Taoist beside him to help carry the luggage. When they went up the mountain, the Taoist children skillfully introduced the scenery of Mount Wudong and the Taoist temple. The old pilgrims probably thought that the young Taoist children were amiable and cute, so they all showed a smile of vicissitudes. They walked and stopped, and their tiredness gradually disappeared. The young martial granduncle knew that the younger generation would not be able to accompany them to the top of the mountain, so he let them go down the mountain first and picked up all the luggage alone. The old people felt apologetic, so the young Taoist, who did not speak much along the way, smiled and said it was nothing. The old pilgrims saw that he went up the mountain like moving clouds and flowing water, with an indescribable magical style. It really did not seem like he was pretending to be relaxed, so they felt a lot more relieved. Without the young Taoist children, the old pilgrims finally asked a slightly sensitive question, which could not be avoided from the old and new Wudong Mountain. The last time this group of old pilgrims from Yongzhou came to Wudong was more than 10 years ago. This time, it was almost the last time in their lives that they would climb the mountain to burn incense. Most of them did not have a bad impression of Wudong, but their families' descendants were more willing to go to Mount Longhu. Their bodies could not walk, but their words revealed that if they were 20 years younger, perhaps they would really go to Mount Longhu, which produced 3 state teachers in succession. When the young Taoist priest who was carrying a lot of luggage heard this, he did not say anything. He only smiled and appeared naive. In the eyes of the old pilgrims, this was much more pleasing to the eye than trying to put in good words for Mount Wudong. They slowly climbed up the mountain. When they were close to the peak, they met an old Taoist priest who was sitting and looking at the sea of clouds. The old Taoist priest finally recognized the young Taoist priest who was carrying heavy luggage up the mountain. He quickly got up and bowed respectfully, saying, "Greetings to the chief." The young Taoist priest smiled and nodded, which could be considered a greeting. The dozen or so old pilgrims could not believe their ears. They all looked at the young Taoist priest who had accompanied them all the way and listened to how Mount Longhu was and how cold Mount Wudong was. They had indeed heard that the chief of Mount Wudong was surprisingly young. The main reason they came to Mount Wudong to burn incense was that they hoped to meet the new chief. They wanted to take a few glances at him from afar. It would be good to get some immortal air. No matter how Mount Wudong had declined in the past 100 years, it was still the ancestral court of Taoism that had once suppressed Mount Longhu. With the immortal Wang Zhonglo before them, the pilgrims still regarded the new chief as an immortal from the bottom of their hearts. But why is this young immortal carrying the luggage of us old men? Chapter 175. Reincarnated. After knowing the Taoist's identity as the Wudong sect leader, the old pilgrims did not dare to let the number 1 immortal on the mountain carry their luggage for them. The young sect leader could not dissuade the old people, so he could only accompany them all the way to the entrance of the Black Tortoise Hall on the Big Lotus Peak. There were few pilgrims. The young Taoist stood under a 1,000-year-old camphor tree and looked at the pilgrims holding incense and worshipping in all directions. Finally, they threw the incense into the huge incense burner. Wudong Mountain finally had some incense and smoke. He suddenly turned his head and saw a Taoist dressed in a Taoist robe outside the mountain. He held a white-tail horsetail whisk in his hand, and his hair was tied up in a bun made of boxwood. His expression was solemn as he slowly walked through the door. There was no dust on his body. Just by looking at his immortal aura, even the Wudong sect leader under the camphor tree seemed to be far inferior. The young Taoist slightly bowed to the uninvited guest. The slightly older Taoist ignored him and only looked into the Black Tortoise Hall. He could vaguely see the magnificent statue of Jinwu Great Emperor in the hall. The statue was several feet tall, with long hair and bare feet. He wore golden armor and stepped on a black tortoise. The Taoist looked at the red bronze statue and then looked at the incense burner outside the hall. He shook his head and muttered, "Suppressing the demons and ruling the north, only Black Tortoise can stop him?" After becoming the sect leader of Wudong, the Taoist quietly stood far away. He heard the Taoist's question but did not directly answer. He only asked with uncertainty, "Probably." The foreign Taoist frowned. "Even you are not sure?" The young sect leader smiled and asked, "Mount Longhu said that you are the reincarnation of 3 generations of grandmasters. They also said that back then, Grandmaster Lu split the Azure Gall Sword embryo into 3 and you obtained one of them. Tell me, is this true or false?" Unexpectedly, the Taoist shook his head without hesitation. "It's false." The new sect leader of Wudong was probably shocked and was speechless. On the contrary, the Dragon Tiger Taoist priest who was in another sect's territory appeared to be overbearing. Finally, he was willing to take a look. He looked at the number 1 person of Wudong whose aura and demeanor were not as good as any of the Taoist priests in the Taoist master mansion. He asked, "You're called Hong Shixiang?" The fellow called Hong Shixiang nodded his head, squatting down on the stone steps, exchanging glances with each other. Although the Taoist of Mount Longhu in front of him had an overbearing aura, it takes 2 to clap, isn't it? The person squatting there was neither red nor white in the face, as if he had seen a guest from afar, the kind that was half unfamiliar with him. Therefore, he was neither pretentious nor warm, nor did he have a cold expression. Thus, the confrontation between the two was not as tense as before, but instead, it was as if a chicken was talking to a duck. The visitor of Mount Longhu knew that he was called Hong Shixiang. Since Hong Shixiang knew about the Qingdan sword embryo, he naturally knew that this person with a great background had the surname Qi and the name Xianxia. Other than this name being unforgettable, it was more because this person with the surname Qi was not only famous in Mount Longhu and the Taoist Master Mansion, but also in the entire world of Taoism. Qi Xianxia was a genius that was second to none. In the future, he was destined to be the pillar of the orthodoxy. The reason that Wudong knew was very simple. Little Wang Shixiang's swordsmanship was already outstanding enough. But Big Shixiang said that in the sex sword competition, Wang Xiaoping was only third. The second place was an old senior from a blessed paradise. Both of them were suppressed by the young dragon tiger Qi Xianxia. Of course, rumors were just rumors. The truth had to be seen with one's own eyes. In Hong Shixiang's eyes, not only was the horsetail whisk in Qi Xianxia's hand a sword, even the ancient tree under the 1,000-year-old camphor was also a sword. Moreover, they were all unsheathed swords. There was a popular saying in the Jianghu, "I don't hold a sword, but I have thousands of swords." It was probably a vivid portrayal of Qi Xianxia. Hong Shixiang, who was squatting on the stone steps, sighed heavily. Look, the foot of the mountain was full of powerful people and terrifying things. How dangerous! As for why Qi Xianxia came up the mountain, Hong Shixiang was not really an idiot who did not understand the ways of the world. There were not many Taoist temples in Wudong, but there were also quite a number of them. It was inevitable that there would be some small conflicts between Taoist temples. If someone was not convinced, they would visit the temple every now and then to argue. In private, if the young Taoist lost in words, they would use their fists to reason. When he was young, he would ride a bull and wander around the mountains. He would always meet some juniors who had arranged to settle this privately, in a secluded place on the mountain. In the past, he was very happy to watch from the sidelines. Now that he was the chief, he could not clap his hands and cheer. He could only wait until the fight was over and then mediate. On Longhu's side, other than Qi Xianxia, no one else was suitable to come to Wudong. The 4 great Taoist masters were old. Even if they won in a war of words, it would not be glorious. Among the young Taoist masters, Mr. White Lotus was invincible in debate. However, if Hong Shixiang did not care about what Mr. White Lotus said and agreed to it, Mr. White Lotus would probably be helpless. Qi Xianxia was different. Was he really going to fight? Qi Xianxia said that his Qingdan sword embryo was fake. However, no matter how Hong Shixiang looked at it, this guy's edge was hard to resist. Qi Xianxia looked at Hong Shixiang's awkward expression. It did not seem to be fake. Although his state of mind was still calm, he had expected countless situations. He did not expect that the new chief of Wudong would be such an unambitious and irresponsible person. If he did not see Hong Shixiang carrying the luggage for the pilgrims when he went up the mountain, Qi Xianxia would have smashed the statue of Zhenwu the Great Emperor. This was something that could be done with a few strokes of the horsetail whisk. As for whether Wudong and Longhu would become enemies because of this, Qi Xianxia did not care at all. In the Taoist master's residence for hundreds of years, they had a complicated attitude towards Lu Dongxian. No matter how good Lu Dongxian was in poetry and sword, he was still an old immortal on Wudong Mountain. There were countless immortals in Longhu Mountain, and there were also a few great Taoist masters. However, they did not seem to be as approachable as Lu Dongxian. Qi Xianxia had long felt that compared to Lu Dongxian, the Taoist masters in Longhu Mountain's Zhao family's genealogy were more like clay statues in a Taoist temple. They were rigid and distant. They could not drink heroic wine or write soaring poems. They only looked high and mighty. Chapter 176. For a moment, the atmosphere outside the Hall of True Martial Arts was a bit cold. The older Taoist priests kept their distance. Only a few naive and ignorant little Taoist children gathered together to criticize the foreign Taoist priests. In the eyes of these children, whether the young martial granduncle was the leader or not, he was still the number one in the world. Wasn't the king of Beiliang, His Royal Highness, domineering enough? Wasn't he still subdued by the martial granduncle? Of course, this was mostly because they hadn't seen the scene of Su Fengnian beating up Hong Xixiang. But then again, even if they had seen it, the little Taoist children would only think that the martial granduncle was magnanimous and didn't lower himself to the same level as ordinary people. Qi Xianxia took the initiative to ask, "Was the deed of thorough comprehension written by you? Was it not written by your senior brothers?" Hong Xixiang didn't answer the question. "There's nothing to entertain on the mountain. I'll give you one later." Qi Xianxia frowned. Hong Xixiang suddenly asked, "Is the scenery of Jiangnan good?" Qi Xianxia was silent. Hong Xixiang asked, "I heard that Longhu is quite close to Huding County. The weather there isn't cold, right?" Qi Xianxia seemed to be annoyed by this kind of boring question. His tone became colder. "Why don't you go there yourself?" This time it was Hong Xixiang's turn to be silent. Probably thinking of Hong Xixiang's statement that he had never left the mountain, and then associating it with the occasional secret from the Taoist master's residence, Qi Xianxia's expression became strange. He hesitated, then sneered, "Huding County isn't cold right now. It's just that there's a big joke. Your king of Beiliang's eldest daughter Su Weisheng's improper conduct has angered everyone there. Even the capital has heard that there's a lady in the palace who wrote the precepts for women who is very angry, spreading the news that she's going to interrogate this princess who's married to Jiangnan." Hong Xixiang raised his head and asked seriously, "Interrogate what?" Qi Xianxia said calmly, "As the leader of Wudong, you're only concerned about this?" Hong Xixiang smiled, pointed to the statue of Zhenwu Great Emperor in the hall and said, "That person is concerned about the suffering of the people. As for me, I don't have the ambition to help the people like your Taoist master mansion. I only care about the warmth of the mountain. As for the situation at the foot of the mountain, I'm just asking. By the way, tell me, what is the crime?" Qi Xianxia ignored Hong Xixiang and looked at the devil-rinsing primogenitor in the dim hall again. He sighed softly and said, "It has been 1,000 years since it was forged." Qi Xianxia turned around and said, "My path is different from yours. I will go to the Great Void Temple to take the ancient sword that ancestor Lu hung on the eaves. I don't know what crime she was charged with. All I know is that when the princess went to Mount Longhu to burn incense, she was stopped outside the mountain." Hong Xixiang stood up. He took a step forward. Back then, this young martial granduncle had stepped into the heavenly phenomenon realm. Today, he took a step closer and snatched the horsetail whisk from Qi Xianxia, the sword chief of Taoism. On Mount Wudong, the long-awaited arrival of wind and thunder was welcomed. Su Shao of the Great Pillar State led the civil and military officials on the central axis. At the end of the imperial road that ran through the square, he looked up and saw the towering hall on the three-story platform. The Palace of Preservation of Peace was the center of the dynasty, the center of the worship of thousands of dragons. To the entire world, the Palace of Preservation of Peace was just a square inch away. There were no more than 100 people standing here. However, the rise and fall of the empire depended on the people here and the government orders here. Even the slightest breath here would determine the health of the huge empire. The majestic platform on the third floor had a railing carved from white jade, thick red wooden pillars, green eaves, and a golden glazed roof. It was extremely majestic and beautiful. A few years ago, the rear court of the imperial palace was burned down in a fire. Many palaces needed to be rebuilt. The stone and wood within a few hundred miles of the outskirts of the capital had long been cut down and excavated. Su Zhao's Beiliang transported countless giant stones and ancient trees here. One of the cloud dragon stone used as the stone steps of the rear eaves weighed 300 tons. One could see the extent of the labor and cost. At that time, complaints were heard everywhere. The remonstrant officials were even more excited, as if they had been injected with chicken blood. They accused Su Xiao of being a treacherous official, saying that the king of Beiliang was flattering and demanding excessive taxes. There were even people who said that if Su Xiao did not die, the country would not be in trouble. However, the remonstrant officials who boasted of being untainted were really untainted. Su Xiao was still the Su Xiao who could get whatever he wanted, a high and powerful official who could not be moved. Walking on the central axis of the empire and reaching the end, one did not need to lower one's head. As long as one approached, one would see a huge wall of 9 dragons embedded in the ground. The 9 golden dragons were vivid and lifelike, as if they were about to soar into the sky in the next moment. On the left and right sides of the wall of 9 dragons were stone steps leading to the main hall. The civil officials walked on the left and the generals on the right. In the hundreds of years of the Liang dynasty, there had never been a fool who had walked on the wrong path. The older generation of officials all knew that every time Lame Su stepped onto the stone steps on the right side of the wall of 9 dragons, he would pause for a moment and mumble to himself, but no one had ever heard him clearly. Su Xiao was born a martial artist, so every time he went to court, he would walk on the right side, no different from the first time he entered the capital. The imperial court had given him the title of Pillar of the Nation, and now it seemed that there was a bit of a drama going on. It was no wonder that the imperial court had been a chaotic mess back then, with people crying, kneeling, and furious. At this moment, the vast majority of the civil and military officials behind Su Xiao had never discussed politics with this prince of a different surname. So many of them were paying attention to Su Xiao's movements after he walked up the steps. As expected, Su Xiao glanced back at the southern imperial gate. But no one knew what the butcher Lame Su was thinking. Su Xiao thought that once he walked through that gate, he would truly have no choice. Normal people who approached the imperial gate would be questioned. Those who could walk into court would have a lot of glory and wealth, but as for how much they had to pay, that was a difficult question for each family. Even the one sitting high on the dragon chair in the main hall found it difficult to ask. Since the founding of the Liang dynasty, it had never stopped. In the early stages of the restoration of the imperial gate, the assassination of Emperor Huanling by eunuchs in the Jian Palace, and then the attack on the Eastern Palace in the 6th year of Jian. Then there was the case of the scarecrow of Crown Prince Shun He and the case of Emperor Rentai's sudden death from overdosing. Then there was the case of the moving of the imperial palace and the fight over the 3 official temples 50 years ago, and then the recent case of the white dress. Su Xiao muttered to himself and then walked toward Baohe Palace. His eyes were cold. At the Maui embassy, he had already learned that not only had Fengyan provoked the Qingzhou Navy on the Spring God Lake and been questioned by some people, even his eldest daughter, Su Weisheng, who had married off far away in Jiangnan, could not live a peaceful life. The group of bastards behind him really thought that his sword was just for decoration. On this day, Baohe Palace was in a great uproar. The world had only heard that after the court was dismissed. Su Xiao of the Great Pillar of Country had not even left the palace gates when he used the scabbard to cripple a 3rd-rank official. Chapter 177. That night, they had bumped into the white-clothed Guanyin and the ghosts. Even though they couldn't find an inn after entering the city, it didn't matter to them. They wandered around for 2 hours. During this time, several groups of patrolling guards took the initiative to stay far away from them. In the end, Xu Xiu finally found a place to rest by the lake. As they walked, it didn't match with her impression of the ghost city of Fengdu. Inside Xiangfan, it was quite beautiful and prosperous. It was far from being comparable to the cities of Beiliang. King of Jing and Zhaohang had spent 20 years of effort in managing the place. The inn was next to one of the most famous lakes in the world, Skinny Goat Lake. This lake had 10 sceneries. The inn was truly close to the water. It was reasonable for His Royal Highness to take out a large amount of silver as a stepping stone. Su Fengyan didn't immediately rest after he checked in. Instead, he sat on the 2nd floor by the window and asked Bluebird to boil a pot of wine. The green and white luan that Lu Qiu had brewed fell to the window. Bluebird opened the secret letter and handed it over. After Su Fengyan finished reading it, he pinched it between 2 fingers and placed it on the candle flame to burn it to ashes. He gently blew away the ashes and couldn't help laughing. So lively. Bluebird didn't interrupt. She just quietly looked at the young man sitting beside her. She looked at him for more than a decade. She also looked from a girl to a young girl to a woman. As a servant girl in the prince's residence, she didn't seem to work hard without complaint. Furthermore, the female servants in the manor were quite willing to work like cows and horses for His Royal Highness. As for Bluebird, she didn't like to speak. Even when she smiled, she was reserved. As a result, she always gave people the feeling that she was like a piece of snow but as hard as iron. She wasn't as likable as the head servant girl of Wudong Garden, Sweet Potato. Su Fengyan had interacted with Bluebird and had long become accustomed to this kind of self-talk. He very naturally continued to talk and laugh. The letter said that Su Shao finally made a move. Outside of Baohe Palace, he beat a deputy agriculture minister half to death. That guy really doesn't have good eyesight. In the palace, not only did he talk about me playing around with the Qingzhou Navy, he also brought up a pot that didn't boil and said that my eldest sister's conduct was improper. If it were me in the palace, I reckon I wouldn't have the patience to walk out of the throne room. We need to quickly go to Gangnam-do and see my eldest sister first. Then we can immediately go see my second sister and Huang Manor. Eldest sister always says that Jiangnan's water and soil are good and that it has raised a street full of delicious girls, like baskets of green vegetables and radishes. I don't know if this is true or not. Bluebird's smile was somewhat helpless. In fact, the stool was right in front of her, but she was still standing. She was very content. Su Fengyan drank a mouthful of wine and said with a smile, "The letter also said that the Jianghu is very lively right now. The civil, martial, rouge, and other rankings have all been released. The newly released top 10 masters of the martial arts rankings is still Wang Xianji. The position that Wudong's old chief vacated was given to a guy who didn't have any reputation before. He's a machete man from Beimang. I'm very curious as to where these rankings came from. It must be some well-informed fellow who dares to release these rankings. That old man Li beside us has just come out of the Tide Listening Pavilion and he's already on the rankings. However, he's only ranked 8th, one place lower than that machete man. Scary. The old god of swords may be one-armed, but he's made a lot of noise every time he fights. I really can't imagine how shocked the immortals and monsters ranked above him are. Sometimes when I look at the embroidered winter-spring thunder, I feel a little discouraged. I admit that I'm already very lazy when it comes to practicing the blade, but why do I always feel that I'm miles away from these guys? They say that once you enter a noble family, you'll be as deep as the ocean. I think it's better to change it to entering the Jianghu. Those who aren't on the rankings want to enter the rankings, while those who are on the rankings want to be in the top 3. Bluebird, do you think I'll go crazy one day and try to be number 1? Back then, my second sister didn't want me to practice the blade because she was worried about this. Was she afraid that I'd go crazy one day and not care about anything else? Bluebird hesitated. She wasn't willing to speak clearly. She only spoke in a small roundabout way. Practicing martial arts is always good. Su Fengyan rarely thought deeply about Bluebird's past. First, they had known each other since they were young. Second, Bluebird was not a complicated woman. Although Bluebird was not as close as Sweet Potato in Wudong Garden, Su Fengyan believed that in private, the servant girls in the courtyard would be more willing to talk to Bluebird about boudoir. Of course, these kinds of boudoir conversations were not about the love affairs of ordinary families. They were about the matters of the military and the state. Bailiang Palace was a place filled with swords and spears. Even the servants were stained with the arrogance of the imperial court. Since Su Shao could be called the second emperor, then the Bailiang army was like a small imperial court. In this way, what difference was there between the prince's manor and a small imperial palace? It was just that Su Shao never admitted these sensitive facts. Su Fengyan stroked the pair of scabbards embroidered with winter and spring thunder and suddenly laughed. Bluebird smiled. Su Fengyan retracted his fingers as if he had been caught in bed. Although His Royal Highness had 2 sisters, when it came to telepathy, it was like a worm in his stomach. Just now, when he touched the scabbards, he remembered that the pair of scabbards on the table were White Fox's beloved personal items that she had worn for many years. When he touched them, he always felt that he was indirectly touching White Fox's face. This really made Su Fengyan feel strange. He didn't have a fetish for cutting off sleeves. It was really because White Fox's face was too beautiful. Who was the champion of this Rouge review? Wasn't it Nangong Push, who was a man? When the mysterious Rouge House of Yunshan evaluated beauties, they would usually add more than 100 words to the beauty of the women on the list. Only Nangong Push was not mentioned in detail. They did not even mention his gender. When Su Fengyan first got the result, he laughed out loud. He thought that if the world knew that this guy was actually a man, would the woman behind White Fox's face be angry to death? At this moment, Su Fengyan loved the house and its crow. He was very curious about the woman on the list who was evaluated as not inferior to Nangong. He wondered why he had to meet her during this trip. Since White Fox's face was a man, he couldn't be his sister-in-law. Besides, he was doing closed-door training in the Tide Listening Pavilion, so there was no need to snatch the Bailiang. However, Chun Yu, who was evaluated as not inferior to White Fox's face, just happened to snatch back the Bailiang and give it to his brother, Huang Man'er. It was not a joke when he said that he would find a wife for Long Xiong in the early years. Su Fengyan got up and said, "Let's go to the lake." Outside the door, Lu Yangshu and the other 2 retainers took turns to keep watch. At this moment, it was Big Sword Lu Qiantang who was on duty. He silently followed behind the master and retainer. Lean Goat Lake was famous all over the world. In terms of scenery, Lean Goat Lake could be said to be the best in the north and south. There were more than 100 famous scenic spots in the annals of history. Back then, the selection of the 10 sceneries of Lean Goat Lake caused a big fight among the literati. They all had their own praises and fought until their faces turned red. In the end, the Grand Chancellor of Shangyin Academy came forward and gave the final word. Su Fengyan walked on the horse-riding embankment with Blue Bird. The name of the embankment came from the idiom, looking at flowers while riding a horse. The 2 sides of the embankment were full of flowers. It was brilliant every spring and summer. Su Fengyan, who had nothing to do, picked up the winter embroidery knife and teased the embankment along the way, plucking countless flowers. Su Fengyan, who was strolling under the moonlight, was bored to death. He casually picked a topic and said softly, "I'm sure the whole city of Xiangfan already knows that I've entered the city." Bluebird frowned and asked, "Was it King of Jing and Zhao Heng? Who spread the news? Is he trying to kill someone with a borrowed knife?" Chapter 178. Su Fengyan nodded and smiled. "But if I die inside or outside the city, it will be a headache for Zhao Heng and Zhao Sun. If a descendant of a vassal dies in a city under their jurisdiction, it will be harder to clean up their mess than if they were killed by arrows from the Qing Province Navy. If I don't add fuel to the fire in the city, I won't be able to determine if the Jianghu people will be able to kill me outside the city. No matter what, it is reasonable to say that the King of Jing and won't have any direct contact with me. Blue Bird, if I go to Jing'an Palace tomorrow, won't it be too much of a slap to Zhao Heng's face? This vassal king, in any case, was once the man closest to the dragon throne. These past few years, the dragon has roamed the shallows and the tiger has fallen to the plains. Do you think he won't get sick from holding it in? Otherwise, how could he have raised a son like Zhao Sun? Su Fengyan rambled on without the slightest scruple. Blue Bird was his family, and Lu Qiantang was a fallen slave who had become a retainer. As a martial artist of Jianghu, he wouldn't be as concerned about these rebellious words as an official. As expected, Su Fengyan suddenly glanced at Lu Qiantang, who was only vigilant of the surrounding movements. His expression was meticulous. Near a pavilion, there was a thunderous snoring sound. A young man dressed in poor clothes was lying there. The sky was his blanket and the ground was his pillow. He was hugging a wooden sword. The sword was an ordinary sword style, but there was a wine gourd hanging from it. Su Fengyan originally wanted to walk past and not disturb the guy's golden millet dream, but he inadvertently saw half of the guy's face. Su Fengyan was stunned. Blue Bird rarely saw His Royal Highness like this. For a moment, it was as if she was facing a great enemy. She was nervous. Lu Qiantang, who didn't let go of the slightest movement, immediately pulled out his sword. He thought that he had encountered an assassin with a great background. He didn't think that His Royal Highness would only quietly say, "You two stay away first." When Bluebird and Lu Qiantang were far away, Su Fengyan walked forward and lightly kicked the guy to the ground. The swordsman, who was startled awake, first had sleepy eyes. Then he began to curse. Then he had the same expression as Su Fengyan when he saw him. His face was full of disbelief. He wiped the drool from his mouth and rubbed his eyes. Pleasantly surprised, he said, "Surnamed Su." How many times had he said it? But this bastard still wasn't willing to call out Su Fengyan's name. He always said that this name was too effeminate. It was so scholarly that it made him sound like he was from an aristocratic family. The next scene stunned Lu Qiantang. After the young man with the funny wooden sword confirmed His Royal Highness's identity, he punched His Royal Highness in the chest. However, His Royal Highness didn't get angry. Instead, he laughed and punched back. It was probably because that guy felt that Su Fengyan's punch was heavier than his own. In his life, he was the most calculative person. Feeling that he had suffered a great loss, he immediately rewarded Su Fengyan with another punch. In this way, Lu Qiantang saw His Royal Highness in the pavilion wrestling with a Jianghu boorish fellow who could smell the scent of poverty. This clearly exceeded the limits of Lu Qiantang's imagination. In the eyes of this second-level master, the Crown Prince of Beiliang wasn't someone who was easy to talk to. Not to mention that he dared to chase and beat up the great pillar state in the prince's mansion. He pinched Chu Lushan's fat face. Even after he left Beiliang, he first trampled on Qingyang Palace. Then he started the Battle of Spring Deity Lake. Everything happened one after another. When had he ever seen His Royal Highness being beaten like this? Why didn't he fight back? The swordsman Lu Qiantang was a second-ranked swordsman with exceptional eyesight. Naturally, he could tell that His Royal Highness was holding back too much every time he attacked. He was striving to be no different from ordinary people. Lu Qiantang had never dared to think that there was anyone in the world who was worthy of this crown prince's careful treatment. Occasionally, when he was free, he would compare His Royal Highness with the other princes in the capital. However, he always felt that Su Fengyan was more domineering and powerful if they were to really fight. The young swordsman in the pavilion was not a poetic young swordsman sleeping on the lake. He was a stark contrast to Su Fengyan. Not to mention the wooden sword, the gourd he picked from the vegetable garden, dried it, and stored it in the sun to store wine. From head to toe, his clothes were really not worth more than 10 copper coins. On Mount Longhu, Qi Xianxia wore hemp shoes. Moreover, the pair of hemp shoes on the little celestial master's feet did not need to be mended. Moreover, Su Fengyan was more certain than anyone else that the man in front of him was really poor. He was so poor that there were no jingling sounds in his pockets. Poor to the point that there were only 4 walls in his house? In any case, he had a home. After this fellow left home to travel, he could only call the 4 corners of the world his home. He did not know what to eat next. For a swordsman to reach this level, he could not be any more miserable. That guy had been starving for a few days, so he was completely listless from all the fighting. He lay back down and looked at Su Fengyan's luxurious clothes. With a face full of disbelief, he asked weakly, "Brat, which family did you steal the clothes of? You even have 2 good swords. They must be worth a lot of money, right? Alright, I have to hurry to the top of the city wall to look at the portrait. There's a high chance that you're there. I'll report it to the government tomorrow." Su Fengyan sat on the side and leaned against a pillar. He laughed and said, "Wenhua, oh Wenhua, why don't you have some future prospects? I'm still waiting for you to make a name for yourself so that I can take advantage of you. Why are you still like this? You're just as sloppy as you were 2 years ago. How many meals have you not eaten?" Unsurprisingly, it was the young swordsman who would never be able to make a name for himself. He rolled his eyes and laughed as he scolded, "Stop talking nonsense. Su, if you still have some conscience, then take off this eyesore of a set of clothes and exchange it for some good wine and meat. Only then can we be considered brothers." Su Fengyan laughed and said, "All right, you can eat your fill with wine and meat." When Hua was stunned for a moment, he sighed and said, "Young Su, although you've changed your clothes, you haven't changed your conscience." Su Fengyan deliberately flicked his clothes with his finger and said, "I've long said that I'm one of the richest children in Beiliang. Do you believe me now?" When Hua said unhappily, "Who told you to pretend? Tomorrow I'll make you invite me to the Xiangua Alley to throw money. You'll be exposed." Su Fengyan asked, "The Xiangua Alley?" When Hua chuckled and said, "White steamed buns." This was Wen Hua's catchphrase. Su Fengyan smoothly took over and said, "White is nothing but a lady's chest. Oh, is it a good brothel?" Wen Hua smacked his lips and said with a yearning expression, "The best place in Xiangfan City. A few days ago, I saw a leading lady in the Xiangua Alley from afar. Just now, I was dreaming of doing it with her. In the end, I was King woken up by you. No, you have to compensate me." Su Fengyan slanted his eyes and said, "What are you pretending to be a hero for? Didn't you say that you won't lose your virginity before you return home in glory?" When Hua said helplessly and discouraged, "You won't allow me to enjoy my mouth." Su Fengyan asked, "Find a place to get some beef?" When Hua swallowed his saliva and shook his head and said, "The night ban in Xiangfan City is too scary. I can't tell if you're really wanted, or if you'll go out tomorrow to reward our internal organs." "That's right, where's old Huang?" "Why? Last time he accompanied you to suffer, but this time he didn't accompany you to enjoy life? You're not honest, kid." Su Fengyan said calmly, "He's dead." When Hua haggled over small matters. If someone dared to give him less than a copper coin, he would dare to roll on the ground like a country shrew. However, he was rather open-minded when it came to important matters. When he heard the news, he was only shocked and regretful for a moment. He sighed and said, "If he's dead, then he's dead. He'll just reincarnate better. Where is he buried? If it's not too far, I'll burn incense and serve wine next Qingming festival." Old Huang was a good person. "I don't care about other people's lives, but I still have to go to old Huang's grave." Su Fengyan said softly, "He died at the Eastern Sea's Martial Emperor City. There's no grave." When Hua said in bewilderment, "Why did he run to the Martial Emperor City? If I remember correctly, old Huang was from Western Shu? That Western Shu accent, when I first met you guys, it almost made me want to commit suicide. These 2 years without old Huang nagging beside my ear, I'm rather lonely." "That's right, it's quite lonely." Su Fengyan looked at the moon in the middle of the lake and muttered, "It's quite lonely." Chapter 179. When Hua said angrily, "Su, watch your mouth. What servant girl's life? Be careful or I'll get angry with you." Su Fengyan rolled his eyes. When Hua raised his head to look at Blue Bird with his mouth full of oil, and he did his best to reveal the most graceful smile in his life as he said shyly, "Miss, just because you called me young Master One, if that Su brat dares to bully you in the future, I'll be the first to take care of him. With his mediocre martial arts, I won't even need to use a sword to beat him down." Su Fengyan laughed loudly and teased, "Young Master One, come, 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 drink." When Hua was in a great mood, it was the first time he'd been called Young Master One. His entire body felt comfortable, and he suddenly felt that besides the woman he adored in his heart, she was the second cutest woman in the world. Such a well-educated and virtuous woman was a servant girl? Only a ghost would believe that. When Hua burped, and the remaining wine was carefully poured into his wine gourd. When Hua threw a glance at Su Fengyan, and Su Fengyan shook his head. When Hua nodded vigorously, causing Blue Bird to be baffled. It was actually Su Fengyan who couldn't dissuade Wen Hua, and he could only awkwardly ask Blue Bird to carry the lunchbox back to the inn first. The two of them ran out of the pavilion like a wisp of smoke, and found a clump of grass near the water. They took off their pants and squatted down at intervals, and their bare buttocks were especially absurd under the moonlight. The two men ruined the scenery like this by taking a dump at Thin Goat Lake. However, if one knew about the hardships of those years, they wouldn't be surprised by the vulgar and despicable actions of this pair of buffoons at this moment. To a nobody like Wen Hua who was crazy poor, the most king happy thing in the world wasn't eating, drinking, and sleeping, but the word shit, because only when one was full would one have the capital to shit, and this was a very shallow principle. When Hua, who was squatting by the lake, exhaled a long breath, and he said leisurely, "Who knows, There might have been some poet or elegant scholar who recited poems here in the past. When I think of this, I feel great. Su Fengnian did not say anything. He believed that King of Jing and Zhaohang would never have thought that the crown prince of Beiliang would urinate and defecate beside the thin goat lake. When Hua was slightly bored when he saw Su Fengnian didn't move, and he suddenly smacked his lips in shock. Su, there's a stone tablet behind the place where I shit. Su Fengnian finally could not bear it any longer and cursed. That's the record of the Slender Goat Lake written by the governor of the previous dynasty, Li Mi. You son of a b****sh really know how to pick a place. When Hua was speechless for a moment, and then he said in his heart, I've sinned, I've sinned. Su Fengnian hesitated for a moment before he asked softly, When Hua, do you want to continue hanging out with me? Just like in the past, walking around and taking a look? If you run into another martial arts competition to find a spouse, I'll take care of you. When Hua laughed and said, do you really think I'm stupid? Kid, you're amazing now and I don't care who you are. In any case, I still think of you as a brother, but brothers are brothers. Although freeloading is natural law, if you're willing to part with money, I'm afraid I won't have the heart to endure hardships. So, you go your own way and I'll go mine. If we're fated to meet again, then we'll meet again. Heh, Wen Hua, don't talk about anything else. But when it comes to practicing the sword, I'm afraid I won't have the heart to endure hardships again. Kid, I appreciate your good intentions. Tomorrow I'll be leaving the city, and I want to go to the Beimang border to take a look. Just take it as broadening my horizons. Su Fengnian said softly, The border is going to be chaotic. You take it easy. When Hua exclaimed in surprise, and joked, Chaotic? Are you really the son of an aristocratic family from Beiliang? Su Fengnian said with a laugh. Isn't that so? When Hua sighed and said, Earlier, I said I'd treat you to a meal of fine wine and meat, but I never thought I'd owe you another meal when we meet again. Su Fengnian said, You owe me then. Kid, just don't die, otherwise, there'll always be a chance to pay me back. When Hua chuckled and said, According to old Huang's words, I'd have to say something like this at this time. Su Fengnian said absent-mindedly, That's right. When Hua suddenly shouted, The blades of grass on my side are fucking ridiculously small. It's not easy to wipe my ass. Seems your side is a bit wider. Hurry up and throw some over. Su Fengnian cursed and threw over a clump of blades of grass. The two of them returned to the pavilion, and when Hua asked, You're not going back to the inn? Su Fengnian shook his head and said, Let's have a chat. Tell me about that young lady of yours. The two of them chatted until dawn, and then when Hua glanced at the dawn sky before he stood up and said, All right, I'm going out of the city. Help me remember the wine and meat that I owe you. Right, help me thank that good young lady. I've never been called young master by anyone in my entire life. Su Fengnian hesitated for a moment before he asked, I have an old senior that uses the sword by my side. Do you want to meet him? When Hua held the wooden sword tightly, and then he smiled as he shook his head and said, No, that's someone else's sword in the end. Even if senior is willing to teach me, I won't be able to learn it. Su Fengnian teased. Didn't you always want to be taken as a disciple by an expert in the past? When Hua said sternly, I only thought about it. I remember old Huang said that practicing the sword requires sincerity. Just like pilgrims praying to gods and Buddhas. Sincerity will work. But I've been idle for the past 2 years, so I've pondered over an unreasonable principle. The sword is my own. With my aptitude, if I walk the path of someone else, I won't be able to achieve anything in my lifetime. I don't have the habit of owing people. I can't really owe you a few meals of wine and meat until my hair turns white. Let's go. Don't be so wishy-washy like a woman. When Hua was full of smiles. The steamed bun is white, but it's not as white as a young lady's chest. Su Fengnian's smile was intoxicating. The tip of a lotus is perky, but it's not as perky as a young lady's butt. On the long embankment of the willows, the wooden sword when Hua and the dual blades Su Fengnian high-fived and brushed past each other. Chapter 180. Su Fengnian took a few steps and turned around to send off the man, the pot, and the wooden sword as they walked across the long dike. Blue Bird stood there gracefully. Lu Qiantang had a solemn expression, but he was full of doubts. In the end, he could not guess the identity of the poor and pedantic young man. Given the wealth of Su Fengnian on the Long Dike, which was second only to the current emperor, it could be said that he was surrounded by nobles. The Dongyue swordsman had seen the liveliness of Bailiang Palace in the first month of the Lunar New Year. Those officials who enjoyed the shade under the big tree of the king of Bailiang could be said to be all feudal officials. When they met His Royal Highness, they had to put on an attentive smile on their faces. Lu Qiantang vaguely felt that the man with the wooden sword came from a humble background, but he did not dare to believe it. Or rather, he did not want to believe it. To this Bailiang servant, he would rather have Su Fengnian be a master who had no shrewdness. That way, it would be easier to serve him. One Su Dezhuguo was enough for him to not dare to breathe. If Su Fengnian was an ambitious fellow with great talent and bold vision, then being in the king's company was like being in the company of a tiger. Today, he had provoked the king of Jing, and tomorrow, would it be the king of Guangling's turn? The day after tomorrow? How many years could Lu Qiantang, who still had a great pursuit of the way of the sword, live to practice the sword? Walking back to the inn with Blue Bird, Su Fengnian asked and answered his own question. Wen Hua did not want to see Li Chungang, but if I mention the name of the old god of swords, don't you think that kid will regret it? Even if I want to roll on the ground, I will still leave. This is where I am not as good as Wen Hua. He always knows what he cannot do and does it. Back then, every time there was a martial arts competition for a spouse, he would eagerly go up the arena. When the other chivalrous men jumped up, he had to obediently walk up the stairs. He pretended to be thick-skinned, but in his heart, he cared more than anyone else about those supercilious looks. But no matter how many times he was beaten off the arena, he would still go up the stage whenever he had the chance, just to be able to exchange moves with others. But in the end, I did not see him return what he learned. Why bother? While he was talking to himself, Zhang and I and the old god of swords just happened to be out sightseeing at the Thin Goat Lake. Su Fengnian kindly threw a smile at them, but no one paid him any attention. After returning to the inn, Su Fengnian ate his breakfast and hid in his room to pick out the moves from the martial arts manuals in his mind. They were all the essence of the top-secret manuals, such as the Greenwater Pavilion Sword Training Manual and the Whale Killing Sword. Originally, it would be best to have Li Chungang to guide him in this kind of technical work. With Su Fengnian's little experience, he was far from being able to give advice. But even with his knees, he knew that the old god of swords, who dared to criticize the outline of 1,000 swords as worthless, would not even bother to move his mouth. Sigh, if only White Fox's face was by his side. However, on the ship, Li Chungang had taught Su Fengnian a mysterious way of flicking the sword. He explained the sword moves and sword aura in simple terms, which had already benefited Su Fengnian greatly. Originally, he was like an idiot who had a mountain of treasures in front of him. After picking and choosing, he finally knew what to do. Yu Yue carried Wu Meinyang and knocked on the door. After Blue Bird opened the door, she said that she wanted to go sightseeing. Su Fengnian did not stop her and instructed Xu Xiu and Lu Qiantang to be her attendants. When Yu Yue saw that Su Fengnian had no intention of going out, her expression became gloomy and her interest was somewhat reduced. Su Fengnian saw this and did not change his original intention. Zhang and I did not have time to study, so Su Fengnian had Blue Bird go to the bookcase and pick out a few secret manuals. Among them, there was a secret manual on spear techniques called Arms Sutra, which was rumored to be written by the horse-racing spear Wu Kuang. The reason why Su Fengnian was particularly interested in it was because Li Chungang had occasionally mentioned it. The old sword god took a few glances and asserted that this book was a secret record of the spear immortal Wang Xiu's experience when he was young. However, after he became famous, he found it vulgar and refused to admit it. Thus, he used the name of his direct disciple Wu Kuang. When Su Fengnian flipped through the book, he saw that Blue Bird's expression was abnormal. He asked, "Do you know Wu Kuang?" Su Fengnian was just asking casually. Unexpectedly, Blue Bird nodded her head. Wang Xiu was one of the 4 grandmasters who were equally famous as Li Chungang. At that time, he was known as the world's #1 spear art. His junior brother was now Su Zhao's personal guard. Other than taking in Wu Kuang as his disciple, his most prized disciple, Chun Jibao, had surpassed his master. It was rumored that he had died under the spear of a villain. However, for some unknown reason, Wang Xiu's weapon, the instant spear, had never appeared in the world after this grandmaster's death. Perhaps it was because Chun Jibao's betrayal of his master was too unpopular. Or perhaps it was because he wore a white robe and carried a sword all year round. It seemed that no one had ever taken this rumor seriously. When Chun Jibao finished his apprenticeship, he was only in his early 20s. Even Wang Xiu was not as strong as Wang Xianji. The older he got, the more immortal he looked. However, Chun Jibao was indeed worthy of being Wang Xiu's disciple. Just like Wang Xiu's cold and murderous spear art, he pressed forward courageously on the battlefield, leaving no way out for himself or his enemy. However, even with Su Fengyan's identity, he had never seen Chun Jibao's spear art. In his impression, this villain, who seemed to be in love with his second sister, Su Weisheng, only knew how to ride a white horse and wear a white robe. He was very amiable to everyone. Usually, he was gentle and kind like a bodhisattva who saved people from suffering. Su Fengyan was puzzled. "Have you guys fought before?" Bluebird shook her head. Su Fengyan saw that it was hard for her to say, so he didn't ask anymore. Even though he was extremely curious, he held back his curiosity. Ever since he was young and saw her being led by his mother, he only knew that she was called Bluebird. After that, he never probed further. He was so used to it that he thoughtlessly forgot that as long as one was a person, they would have a surname and a name. For example, the maidservant's name was Hong Musk. Su Fengyan also knew that she was called Song Xiaofeng. As for whether Bluebird was her real name or just a nickname, Su Fengyan really didn't know. After returning from his travels, he learned that Wutong Garden was not a small pool where one could see the bottom at a glance. The maidservants were not simple vases without any stories. However, when it came to Bluebird, Su Fengyan selfishly hoped that she was just Bluebird, the girl that his mother had brought over to be his childhood sweetheart. Chapter 181. Arm scripture implied that the spear in one's hand was the third arm. The spear techniques recorded in the book were exquisite and profound. Su Fengyan roughly picked out 3 moves and counted with his fingers. 16 moves had already been painstakingly scoured out by Su Fengyan from various secret martial arts manuals. Aunt Zhao, who was keeping a low profile in the Qingyang Palace, said that he wanted to achieve 50 moves that were unrivaled under the heavens. However, not to mention whether the moves that Su Fengyan picked out could be incorporated into the blade, just looking at the number, it was still far from 50 moves. Ever since Su Fengyan personally witnessed the old god of swords using the flick of fingers on the ship, he developed the unique habit of flick of fingers. His finger lightly flicked the cover of Arm Scripture, and he gathered the 16 moves that could save his life in his mind. When he arrived in front of Shangfan City, the Great Yellow Court that was as deep as the sea and as inexhaustible as the Great Yellow Court was only at the second-floor realm. He could probably break 6 armors with one strike. However, the Dharma King of the Red Sect, who looked like a white-clothed guanyin, could see through 3 floors with one strike. Su Fengyan had weighed it and found that it was not a problem for him to break 9 armors with one strike. Even though it was only an increase of 3 armors, it was still a huge improvement. The most important thing was that when he used the Spring Thunder Blade again, there was no stagnation like before. His right hand used the embroidery of winter, while his left hand used the Spring Thunder Blade with the gravity of Spring Thunder. His techniques were completely different. This was where Su Fengyan's confidence in his 50 moves came from. In addition to the set of fist techniques of the bull-riding Hong Shixiang and the wonderful deed of thorough comprehension, Su Fengyan was not so frightened by the old god of swords' few strikes that he did not dare to practice the blade. At noon, when they ate downstairs at the inn, they were all talking loudly and spitting saliva everywhere. Ginger listened with great interest. The old god of swords, who was wrapped in a smelly sheepskin fur coat, rolled his eyes and put one leg on the bench. He chewed on meat while picking his earwax. The appearance of the civil and martial evaluations and the rouge evaluations was the most sensational event in the scholarly world and Jianghu. Perhaps it was because there was no first place in the civil and martial evaluations, but the martial evaluations and the rouge evaluations were still the most talked about. This generation of the martial evaluations did not disappoint. There were 18 first-level experts and the most talked-about top 10 experts. As expected, the master of the martial emperor city, Wang Xianji, continued to be the number 2 in the world. Next was the new god of swords, Dong Tai, who was ridiculed by the people of Jianghu for being the number 2 for 100 years. The third was still an old face, Chao Guanzi, who was praised as the most outstanding scholar in the world. Along with this came another big piece of news. Wang Mao, who occupied the 4th place, was ashamed to be ranked behind Chao Guanzi but was ashamed to be ranked ahead of Bei Mang, who was ranked 7th. Hong Jingyan, who was ranked 1st on the martial evaluations, was immediately pushed to the heart of the storm. He and the god of swords, Li Chungang, became the hottest topic of the day. In the martial evaluations, which did not only look at the level of martial arts but also the level of talent, there was an extremely interesting saying. It could be summarized as Guanyin, Guanyin, Jingguan, South Lu Zuzu, and North Xinwu. Of the 4, Su Fengyan had already met 3 of them. The one who rode the bull, Wu Luding of the sword tomb of the Wu family, and the female Dharmaraja dressed in white. The only remaining one was little Lu Zukishenxia from Mount Longhu. However, the latter had already met Su Fengyan on the fishing platform. Other than the martial evaluations, the Rouge evaluations also caused a great commotion. Nangong Push and Chun Yu occupied 1 or 2 of the martial evaluations. However, they were different from the other women who had long ago stunned the world. These 2 had never been famous, which made them even more attractive. But what Su Fengyan was most proud of was that not only did his second sister make a name for herself in the literature review, she also took the 1st place in the Rouge review and Vice review. Other than this, Wang Dongxiang, who took him on the turtle, also made it into the literature review and Vice review. Although she didn't make it to the top, for a girl from a relatively ordinary family, it was a rare honor. Su Fengyan now understood why the gloomy father and son in the city had not made any moves. He glanced at the old god of swords opposite him who could attract countless supercilious looks. Everyone in Jianghu knew that there was this immortal who was known as the Green Snake in 2 sleeves and 1 sword by his side. The swordsmen in Shangfan City who were itching to get rid of evil for the people would have to be 10 times more courageous. Who would dare to make a move? Zhang and I heard that some of the old god of swords in the restaurant had finally come out of seclusion, only to be the accomplice of a villain in Bailiang Palace. They all said that the old god of swords had become muddle-headed and that he could not protect his integrity in his later years. With old god of swords' attitude, it was likely that he would not be able to compete with Dong Tai for the title of the world's number 1 sword. She was very angry, especially when she saw that the old man only cared about eating meat and drinking wine. She said indignantly, "Hey, didn't you hear them? They're all talking bad about you." Old Manly said cheerfully, "I heard them. This old man is not deaf." Zhang and I was probably angry that he did not fight back. She put down her chopsticks and stretched out her small hand. She said angrily, "Give me back the talisman." The old god of swords pretended to be surprised and asked, "What?" Zhang and I repeated it again. The old man still pretended to be dumb and asked something. The little mudman stared at him a few times and finally gave up. She completely ignored this old man who could clearly split the river with 1 sword and let others talk bad about him. Su Fengyan was not amused by her childish behavior and laughed out loud. Zhang and I heard it and angrily said, "What are you laughing at? I'm not going to study today." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "If you don't laugh, then don't laugh. Let me talk to you. What kind of status does old god of swords Li have? Do you need to lower yourself to the same level as these short-sighted people? You can't let the old god of swords, the 8th master in the world, fight with these people, right?" Zhang and I snorted coldly and said, "Only the 8th." Su Fengyan used his chopsticks and pretended to hit Zhang and I. In the end, he did not really do it. Old Manly rubbed his chin and said, "Indeed, only the 8th. Which son of a bitch made the ranking? We need to talk about it. This old man was once the number 1 in the world. In this way, compared to the 11th master in the world, he is more miserable. We need to talk about it." Su Fengyan said regretfully, "My Huang Man'er is actually not on the martial arts rankings sub-ranking. We also need to talk about it. The old god of swords laughed and said, although I haven't seen that idiot's physique with my own eyes, this old man reckons that this kid who was born at the Vajra realm will become a freak who is invincible under the mysterious realm in a few years. Longhu Zhao Shituan. This old man had seen him a few times. This sloppy old Taoist's ability was not high, but his vision was not bad. In the next martial arts ranking, Su Longxiang will be able to secure a place in the top 3 if nothing unexpected happens. If someone like Wang Xianji does not appear in the pugilistic world in the next 20 years, it is even possible for him to fight for the championship. Of course, with someone like Wudong's Hong Shixiang who cultivated the heavenly Tao, it was hard to say that he was the number 1 in the world. This old man claimed to be invincible back then, but he was actually guilty. After all, he had never fought with Qi Xuanjin. That's strange. Su Xiao has 4 children. Su Weisheng and Su Longxiang are all extraordinarily gifted characters. Why is it that you, Sheila, can't fight normally? Su Fengyan laughed shamelessly and said, we can't take all the good things in the world. We have to leave something for others to remember. At this moment, a group of young scholars walked in from outside the building. Their faces were full of anger as they cursed the immoral fellow for shitting in front of the records of the Slender Sheep Lake. Su Fengyan saw Jiang and I staring at him and asked, does it look like I did it? Jiang and I laughed coldly and said, it must be you. Su Fengyan gave a thumbs up and said, smart. Jiang and I could not eat anymore. Su Fengyan asked, are you really not going to study today? Jiang and I put on a straight face. Su Fengyan asked again, you spent 1 tael of silver on Mount Lao. Don't you feel heartache? Are you not going to earn money? Jiang and I did not make a sound. But in the afternoon, she held a book and stood outside Su Fengyan's room. She did not knock for a long time. Su Fengyan did not make things difficult for her. He walked out of the room and said with a smile, you're not going to study today, and I'm not going to listen. Let's go out and play. Chapter 182. Su Fengyan was kind enough to take Jiang and I out to relax, but she kept thinking about all the rumors she heard about the ghost city in Xiangfan. Admiring the lake with Su Fengyan was already the limit of her courage, so she did not dare to go out again. Even though Su Fengyan rarely made a losing deal and said that as long as she went out, he would treat it as if she had studied 10,000 words, Jiang and I did not hesitate to refuse. Su Fengyan could only give up. He could not tie her up and go out. Besides, the itinerary was Jiaoyu Lake, where the Yin-Chi was the heaviest. He reckoned that when the time came, she would fight him to the death. When Wang Yangming's army was defeated and the city was broken, he cut out his eyes and committed suicide on the city wall. His last words were that he wanted to keep his eyes to see how Su Xiao would lose his reputation. That place was not a good place to enjoy the scenery. Jiang and I did not go, and the old god of swords, who was the stabilizing force in the chaotic situation, naturally would not follow. Su Fengyan could only remove 3 of his retainers and bring along the halberd Ning Amei. Without waiting for Su Fengyan to ask Blue Bird to call for people, Ning Amei strode over with a serious expression. After making sure that there was no one in the corridor, he said in a low voice, Your Highness, King of Jing and Zhao Heng, is here. Su Fengyan was stunned. He narrowed his eyes and asked, How many soldiers and armor did he bring? Ning Amei shook his head and said in a low voice, He did not bring any soldiers. Other than a few personal guards, he only brought Zhao Sun and a woman. She seems to be Princess Jing, and Su Fengyan was shocked beyond words by King of Jing and's antics. Could it be that he had brought his wife's collar to beg for forgiveness? Otherwise, he would not have let Princess Jing and show her face in public. The fact that he did not bring any armor, spears, or halberds was already enough of a show of sincerity. For example, Su Xiao had never been courteous to the wise. When you came to his residence, he had already given you enough face by opening the front door. No matter how useless the King of Jing was, not to mention how glorious he was in the past, he was now one of the 6 great vassal kings. If he abided by the law of the vassal kings, he would not dare to muster a large force. But why would he need to come in person? How was that possible? Su Fengyan furrowed his brows as his thoughts raced. For a moment, He did not notice that Ning Amei was sizing him up. Outside the room, Jiang and I was holding a book with an indifferent attitude, as if even if the sky fell, His Royal Highness would be there to support it. On the other hand, the meticulous blue bird saw Ning Amei's expression and immediately felt an indescribable murderous intent. Ning Amei seemed to have noticed it. He slanted his eyes and smiled calmly at Blue Bird. Su Fengyan was thinking about how to deal with this situation and ignored the confrontation between Blue Bird and Ning Amei. He paused for a moment and smiled. "Let's go, General Ning. Let's go and take a look. I heard that Princess Jing-en is an extremely charming beauty. If I remember correctly, she is one of the beauties in this Rouge Review. She is almost 40 years old and still able to be on the list. She must be a very beautiful woman." Ning Amei smiled and led the way. The appointment was to be held in a secluded room in the corner of the inn. Unknowingly, Lu Yangshu and the other two had gathered behind Su Fengyan. By the time Su Fengyan entered the room, even Li Chungang was standing silently in the corner. At the door stood two imperial bodyguards of the Prince of Jing'an's estate who were in the prime of their lives. Their auras were strong and unending. One of them wielded a saber, while the other was empty-handed. There was a scent of the battlefield that Su Fengyan was no stranger to about them. The old soldiers in the army always said that even ghosts would be afraid of people who crawled out from a pile of hundreds and thousands of corpses. This was because their bodies were tainted with an extreme yang aura that was snatched from the corpses. Therefore, whenever the Bailiang soldiers mentioned the Pillar State and Xiangfan City, they would always proudly say that hundreds of thousands of wandering ghosts were nothing. As long as the great general entered the city alone, those filthy otherworldly items would not even be able to become ghosts. They would perform the 36,000 great ritual of the heavens. The two imperial bodyguards who had just left the battlefield did not stop Su Fengyan. Presumably, the king of Jing and Zhaohang was famous for his shrewdness. Since he was willing to sacrifice his face and personally enter the inn, he would not delay the important matters. Su Fengyan, who was armed with two sabers, did not knock on the door. Instead, he directly pushed the door open. The eldest son of Xiangfan, the crown prince of the king of Jing and Zhao Sun, was standing with his head lowered. A middle-aged, elegant man was sitting on a chair, twirling a string of 108 Tiantai Bodhi beads in his hand. He was reciting the names of the three treasures. His face was unusually pious. Although he was already in his 40s and would soon be over 50, he still had an outstanding demeanor. At first glance, one could tell that he was a handsome man with a jade-like face when he was young. According to the unofficial history, the king of Jing and was most favored by the Empress Dowager and was given the nickname Tanlang because Zhao Hang had been handsome since he was a child. In addition, he was pure filial and docile, so he was able to enjoy the Empress Dowager's love among the princes. After he was crowned, he became even more outstanding and elegant. According to the official history, the sixth prince was good at riding and shooting. He held a long spear in his hand and rode a horse. It was enough to show that Zhao Hang was unparalleled in the past. However, after Su Fengyan entered the inn, he did not go to see Zhao Sun or the king of Vassal who had failed at the last step. It was not that Su Fengyan pretended to be arrogant, but that the woman in the room was too eye-catching. She happened to be sitting sideways. Her body was graceful and graceful. The woman was reading a book. When she turned the page, she lifted the hair on her temples. She was beautiful, and her demeanor was even better. She was classical and graceful, just like a fairy maiden in a painting. Hearing the door open, she turned her head and smiled gracefully. The beauty's smile could topple a city. Su Fengyan's eyes were in a trance. Crown Prince Zhao soon lowered his head and caught a glimpse of this scene. The malice in his eyes grew. He quickly lowered his head and gritted his teeth without saying anything. The hair on the king of Jing and Zhao Heng's temples were gray. Perhaps it was because he had used too much scheming in his life that he was old. Fortunately, a man's temperament was not affected by age. However, compared to Princess Jing-en's beauty who was not past her prime, she was still as radiant as ever. It was somewhat a mismatch. They were already 10 years apart, and now this old man looked even more like a young wife. The world only knew that the princess came from a noble family in the spring and autumn period. Her father was Pei Kai, the most knowledgeable scholar in Western Shu. He was known as Pei Huang Lao. He was famous for being weak, and was especially proficient in the Lao and Yi. He was above the secular world and was fully deserving of the title of a great scholar of the classics. The Pei family withered during the unjust war of the spring and autumn period. Pei Kai died for his country, leaving behind only an orphan. The orphan of the fallen country married into a noble family. A beauty matched with a noble. Su Fengyan only looked deeply at Princess Pei. In the eyes of others, he was a licentious lecher who was extremely rude. A palace guard was about to close the door when Lu Qiantang acted as if he was about to draw his sword. With his back to the door, Su Fengyan coldly said, "Impudent! Don't be rude." He allowed the door to slowly close. King of Jing and Zhao Heng did not rise to greet him. After he finished chanting, he hung the prayer beads and tied them to his well-maintained hands. He raised his head and said warmly, "Fengyan, there are no outsiders here. You and I can call each other uncle and nephew." Su Fengyan restrained his arrogance and returned the favor. He said warmly, "Nephew greets Uncle King of Jing and..." Chapter 183. Perhaps Zhao Heng did not expect the notorious crown prince of Bailiang to be so easy to talk to. His eyes darkened as he gently pinched a Bodhi prayer bead between his index finger and thumb. With a gratified expression on his face, he said, "Brother Su, a tiger does not beget a dog. Back then, I could not compare to him in terms of horsemanship and had no choice but to lose to him in every aspect. It was inevitable that I was unconvinced and thought that I had to make up for it somehow. My son, Zhao Sun, was not suited for martial arts, so I forced him to study hard. I was afraid that even my son would not be able to compare to Brother Su. Today, it seems that I still failed to flatter you and lost by a large margin. By the way, Fengyan, Uncle Wang took the liberty of coming here this time to bring the stupid boy from studying to apologize to you. Zhao Sun's reputation is thin. Even if he knows that he is in the wrong, he would not dare to come here. He had no choice but to ask his mother to step forward and escort him here. I have made a fool of myself in front of you." Princess Fei's laughter could topple a nation. Zhao Heng looked at his son, Zhao Sun, with a faint smile on his face. Even when Su Fengyan slapped his face with Shodong on the yellow dragon ship, the latter did not bat an eyelid. When Su Fengyan made fun of him for diving into the water, he jumped so confidently and calmly. However, when his father glanced at him today, it was as if he had been stung by a poisonous object. He immediately raised his head and bowed deeply to Su Fengyan with a solemn expression on his face. It could be said that he was solemnly apologizing to his sworn enemy a few days ago. He only lacked a smile to wipe away the enmity between them. Su Fengyan pulled a chair over and sat down. He stared at Princess Jing An's beautiful face for a while, then turned to the King of Jing An and said with a smile, "This nephew was reckless. How could I accept Brother Su's bow?" Although he said that, he did not have any intention of getting close to Zhao Sun. He accepted the King of Jing An's apology with a clear conscience. Zhao Heng smiled at this, sitting upright on a taisher chair pieced together from red sandalwood. No matter how luxurious the inn's decorations were, they couldn't afford to use rhinoceros horn sandalwood or rooster blood sandalwood to make a chair. Red sandalwood was ranked last among red sandalwood. Its texture was relatively loose, and its luster and texture were far inferior to the other two. However, red sandalwood usually grew slowly, and it didn't have any great material. Ordinary high-ranking officials and dignitaries would be grinning from ear to ear if they had a sandalwood chair. Scholars and poets would love a small sandalwood fan so much that they believed this low-grade red sandalwood chair was already the inn's housekeeping treasure. King of Jing An's nickname was Sandalwood. His love for red sandalwood was only second to Little Ginger's imperial uncle from West Chu, who had built a sandalwood palace. Zhao Heng said that he would not sit unless it was sandalwood, nor lie down. It seemed that this was not an exaggeration. Su Fengyan looked at the 108 mani pearls in Zhao Heng's hand and praised. Uncle Wang is indeed a devout believer of Buddhism. When the Tiantai Bodhi seed was plucked, It was a hard golden yellow. Most eminent monks would only turn from golden yellow to pale yellow after holding the pearls for several decades. In Uncle Wang's hands, it turned from pale yellow to milky white. As the old saying goes, sincerity can move metal and stone. With Uncle Wang's sincerity, what bodhisattva would not bless you? King of Jing and laughed and said, I have long heard that Fengyan and I worship Buddhism. It seems that it is true. Shang-Er, on the other hand, still can't recognize that this is a Tiantai Bodhi seed. Last year on my birthday, Shang-Er took the initiative to give me a string of walnut prayer beads. Although each walnut was carved with 6 luohan, according to the Buddhist Sutra of measuring and counting beads, the material of the prayer beads is different. Therefore, the merit obtained during practice is greatly different. The core is only 2 times, the iron is 5 times, the copper is 10 times, the lotus seed is 10,000 times, but the Tiantai Bodhi seed in my hands is 10 million times. Fengyan, if it were you, would you want the rope used to tie the walnut or the string in Uncle Wang's hands? Su Fengyan was surprised and said, if I remember correctly, the Vajra seed prayer beads are 10 million times the merit, and the Tiantai Bodhi seed is the most superior of all. Zhao Heng's 2 fingers clasped the faded color of the Tiantai Bodhi seed. He squinted his eyes and said with a smile, after all, Uncle Wang is old and always remembers incorrectly. He has to admit that he is old. Princess Jing An's appearance and bearing were like that of an empress. Perhaps she was infected by the harmonious atmosphere. She lost some of her deliberate dignity. 2 slender fingers pinched a page of a book and 1 hand rested on her cheek as she looked sideways at Su Fengyan. Her eyebrows were naturally charming. It seemed that she was quite curious about His Royal Highness from Beiliang, who had come from afar. The junior in front of her could no longer be considered a child. Even in Qingzhou, there were many sayings about him, including the Su family's phoenix who was a prodigal son of the family. Moreover, Xiangfan had been destroyed by Su Shao and Wang Yangming. The majestic city had once become a ghost city. The scholars of Qingzhou knew that they could not convince the king of Beiliang with words, so they took pleasure in wantonly criticizing the hedonistic behavior of the crown prince of Beiliang. Su Fengyan and Princess Pei looked at each other and said with a smile, Auntie is really beautiful. Princess consort Jingon stared blankly for a moment. Zhao Heng gently pinched the prayer beads he was using to suppress his delusional thoughts and took the opportunity to joke. Your auntie is naturally good-looking. In the year of the phoenix, is there any noble young lady from Qingzhou that you fancy? Uncle Wang can help you snatch her away. Su Fengyan's skin was as thick as the walls of Xiangfan. He climbed up the pole and said shamelessly, originally, I was thinking about a Qingzhou lady that I met by chance on the Spring God Lake. What was her name again? I remember now, Lu Xiu'er. I think her family's ancestor was the old minister of the Pillar State in the capital. In terms of family background, she could be a good match for me. But after seeing Auntie today, I don't want to think about her anymore. Zhao Heng dismissed it with a smile. Crown Prince Zhao Sun was so angry that his lips were ashen and his entire body was trembling. Fortunately, he was standing to the side with his head down. Next to the king of Jing and princess consort, he was very inconspicuous. What followed next was an even more boring chat. Borrowing the momentum of the civil, military, and rouge reviews, there was no lack of topics to talk about. Su Fengyan's eloquence had long been honed by the courtesans of Beiliang to a profound level. It was more than 10 times better than his knife skills. When the king of Jing mentioned that the review this time only lacked a general review, he even spoke up for Su Shao, who had humiliated him in the past. This time, the general review did not appear. The reason was that there were no famous generals after the spring and autumn period, and after the spring and autumn period, there were only blue eyes. Since the general review could not produce anything, why would there be a need for another review? However, anyone with a discerning eye could see that this statement greatly praised the current Chancellor Zhang Julu. It almost pushed him to the height of being able to support the country alone. The king of Jing and Zhao Heng finally stood up. Su Fengyan gently bowed and said goodbye. When leaving the room, of course, Zhao Heng should be the first. Originally, Princess Pei should be the second, followed by the junior Su Fengyan and Zhao Sun. Su Fengyan, intentionally or otherwise, lagged behind a few steps. Princess Pei's temperament was indifferent. In addition, the shameless Zhao Sun was in a hurry to escape. Thus, Su Fengyan and Princess Pei walked side by side. When they crossed the threshold, this beauty from a noble family trembled. Her autumn eyes, filled with the aura of Jiangnan, widened. With an expression of disbelief, she looked at the young man who had repeatedly called her aunt. How dare he? Su Fengyan had an innocent expression on his face. He softly said, "Aunt, nephew has chosen a pair of bracelets. In a moment, I will have someone send it to the prince's mansion." Her ears were completely red. She did not make a sound. Her buttocks, which were covered by the brocade robe, felt waves of numbness. How dare he be so licentious and absurd? Chapter 184. When King of Jing and Zhao Hong heard this, he didn't seem to notice Princess Pei's strange expression. He turned his head and smiled. "Fengyan is very considerate." Su Fengyan laughed and said that it was something he should do. He walked them out of the inn and waited until the three of them got on an ordinary carriage. It was obvious that the carriage was quite narrow. The horses were good horses that even wealthy families could afford. Other than the two strong and sturdy attendants and bodyguards, everything was quite plain. This family of three, who was only one step away from owning the imperial palace in the capital, came and went quietly. On the surface, they were full of the Buddhist aura of a believer in Buddhism, the fairy aura of a beauty, and the friendliness of a distant relative. However, who could understand the murderous intent behind each step? Only Bluebird saw that after leaving the room, His Royal Highness didn't show his back to King of Jing and Zhao Hong. His lapel was already soaked through. The Crown Prince of Beiliang looked at the flying dust at the end of the road and finally turned around peacefully. He ordered Bluebird to buy a copy of Qingying Study House's version of The First Snow. Then he walked back to the room alone and closed the door. He sat on the chair that was still warm and let out a long breath. He looked at the sandalwood chair and murmured, "In just a few hours, Zhao Hong has already pinched the prayer beads 4 times. Su Xiao was right. This sanctimonious king of Jing and is as vicious as a woman. Zhao Hong probably doesn't know that I have long known about his secret habit of killing people with each pinch of the prayer beads. The first pinch of the Bodhi beads was because he was surprised that I wasn't as rebellious as the rumors said. He began to suspect that my absurd behavior in Beiliang over the years was because I was pretending to be stupid. Secondly, he was angry that this Shizi's memory was not bad. He clearly remembered what was written in the Buddhist Sutra of measuring pearls and counting pearls' merit and virtue. He was able to see through his deliberate mistakes. The third pinch was to abhor my undisguised desire for Princess Pei. As for the last pinch, it was interesting. He actually crushed a Tiantai Bodhi seed that was as hard as gold and stone. I originally thought that he was going to shed all pretenses of cordiality, but I didn't expect that Zhao Sun's mental fortitude was already so good. This old man is even more experienced and ruthless. It seems that after pretending to cultivate and pray to Buddha for several decades, there are some results. In terms of acting skills, he is indeed better than me." Su Fengyan's words were teasing, but his tone was terrifyingly gloomy. He shook his uncomfortable clothes and leaned against the chair, repeating scene after scene in his mind. He recalled every detail of King of Jing's movements, Princess Pei's subtle frowning and relaxing, Zhao Sun's slight raising and lowering of his head. Finally, Bluebird entered the room with a set of Wang Dongxiang's The First Snow. Su Fengyan took the book, narrowed his eyes, and stood up to change his position. He sat on the chair that Princess Pei had sat on. With a hoodlum smile on his face, he raised his hand and clenched his 5 fingers. He changed his face into a mask and said in an intoxicated manner, "Comfortable. The tip of the lotus flower is raised, but it can't be higher than Xiaonyang's." But, even though Wen Hua's words are crude, he directly said the great principle that scholars have to spend a lot of money to buy. Bluebird was confused. She did not see the unrestrained undercurrent at the door. She reckoned that Su Xiao was the only one in the world who dared to think deeply about Su Fengyan's daring feat. Su Fengyan pondered for a moment, then took out one of the books, The First Snow, printed by Qingying Study Room, and flipped through a few pages. If King of Jing'an and Princess Pei were present, they would definitely be shocked by the amazing memory of this nephew of Bailiang. He remembered that in the Sutra of Buddhist Studies and Counting of Beads, the multiplier of the merit of prayer beads was nothing. This was because the pages that Su Fengnian flipped through were exactly the same as the pages that Princess Pei had skipped through several times. Thinking about the subtle changes in Princess Jing'an's expression every time, Su Fengnian lowered his head to look at the contents of the book. With a strange smile, he said, "This beautiful auntie does not seem like a woman who is soft on the outside but strong on the inside. Pei Kai, who was born in a rich and powerful family, is an unyielding literary hero. How could he train such a weak and delicate daughter? Compared to the women of Qingzhou who like to fight and scheme the most, she could be said to be a weirdo. I reckon that if this auntie was not so beautiful, she would not have been able to sit firmly in the position of Princess Consort of Jing'an Palace. Previously, I heard that little girl Lu Xiaoer said that Princess Pei had caused the death of Zhao Sun's mother to be able to sit as the princess consort, and I believed it to be true. This little girl's skin has done a lot of harm. The next time I see her, I won't just touch her small hands and waist." Su Fengnian asked, "Blue Bird, where is the sandalwood box that I asked Wang Lingquan to buy on Mount Lao? Go get it." Blue Bird quietly left and returned. Su Fengnian opened the exquisitely crafted sandalwood box. Inside, there was a string of prayer beads that were rarely seen in the dynasty. The material used was called Paluo Zi in the western regions, and the people of the Central Plains were used to call it Crown Prince. This kind of prayer beads would not be cold in the winter and would not be stained with sweat in the summer. The Crown Prince was strung together in a circle and had a very artistic name, Satisfaction. It was a wonderful object that could not be bought with money. No matter who it was given to, it would not be degraded. If it was given to someone who believed in Buddhism, it was even better. Su Fengnian's original intention was to test the king of Jing'an fiercely when he arrived at Xiangfan. If they could coexist peacefully, he would give this precious bracelet to him. If they turned against each other, he would keep it for himself and give it to Miss Li, who had lived in the temple since she was young. That way it would be more agreeable to her. It was just that in the time it took for a spark to fly off a piece of flint, Su Fengnian was worried that the king of Jing'an would see through the truth. He did not want to give Zhao Sun the impression that he was a cultured person on the outside, but a scheming person on the inside. Therefore, by chance, he came up with that stroke of genius. TSK, TSK, TSK. That feeling was superb. Su Fengnian closed the First Snow in the East Wing book, which had won the title of the First Snow in the East Wing. He said, "In a moment, have Ning Amei deliver this sandalwood box to the Jing'an Palace. Tell him to give it to Princess Pei. I don't believe that the king of Jing'an, this 1,000-year coward, can continue to endure at home. If you make me unhappy, I will set your house on fire." Blue Bird softly agreed. Su Fengnian suddenly asked, "Blue Bird, if I say that bastard Zhao Sun has some kind of abnormal fantasy about Princess Pei, would you believe me?" Blue Bird calmly said, "I believe you." Su Fengnian laughed coldly and said, "This family looks like a group of harmonious people, but turns out it's just a facade. So what if Zhao Sun has pinched the prayer beads 1,000,000 times? Holding the prayer beads in one's hand can increase one's concentration and wisdom. Su Xiao has already made it clear that he is too smart for his own good. Those who achieve great things must not use petty tricks and cleverness. Zhao Sun is a person who cannot let go of anything. If he is willing to let go of something, if he is unwilling to let go, how can he gain anything?" Chapter 185. Su Fengnian laughed and said self-deprecatingly, "It seems like I'm a coward who was scared out of my wits. I don't have the right to criticize someone as ambitious as Zhao Heng." The king of Jing and Bluebird smiled and shook her head. "Zhao Heng has already lost the first move in his discussion with your highness." Su Fengnian smiled and said, "Don't flatter me. The reason why I was able to win by a fluke was because Su Xiao set up the most domineering first move for me. It wasn't my true ability. Humph. I'm still so useless today. It's all because Bluebird and you girls flatter me. Go serve tea as punishment." Bluebird smiled and remembered something. Her expression turned cold as she said, Ningame was disrespectful towards King of Jing En's visit. He wanted to see how your highness would respond. Su Fengyan waved his hand and said, "It's reasonable. Ningame is a brave warrior who can wield a heavy halberd weighing 70 to 80 kilograms. How could he be willing to risk his life for others? Speaking of which, if he kowtowed to me as soon as he saw me, I would suspect that he was a traitorous fence-sitter. Don't mind this small matter. Otherwise, Ningame will laugh at me and look down on me even more." Su Fengyan continued, "In the past, when I heard Su Xiao talk about his experiences, I didn't take it to heart. Now that I look back, I understand a little. Killing an enemy on horseback is all about risking your life. If you win, you're the boss. If you lose, you're the grandson. It's clear. What a headache." No wonder Su Xiao said that scholars were the most ruthless and merciless when killing other scholars. Zhao Heng is one of the most sinister people. Sure enough, to practice the saber, you need to personally fight with the enemy. To develop shrewdness, you need to fight with masters like King of Jing and to gain experience. I don't feel bad about giving you a string of satisfaction worth thousands of gold. Blue Bird took the sandalwood box and left the room, gently closing the door behind her. Su Fengyan took the time to quickly read the last book, The First Snow. Every word was like a gem. He really couldn't understand how a 16-year-old girl could write such a vivid essay. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that her writing was ingenious. Last time when his elder sister went back to Bailiang, he always heard her sigh that she wished the world could have another snow. At that time, he only felt that his elder sister was too sentimental. Now that he flipped to the end, he saw that the ground was covered in snow, and the tragic ending was a clean death. He felt both heartache and peace of mind. It was as if not dying was a failure, and only death was a real life. In the past, Su Fengyan didn't have such a state of mind. If someone died beside him, he would appear to be indifferent, but in fact, he would always be worried for a long time. It wasn't until 3 years ago when he had to walk around in a difficult situation, experiencing hardships and seeing the world's various forms of life that he changed. Su Fengyan said softly, "Old Huang, are you trying to say that my home is where my heart is at ease?" Su Fengyan, who was sitting alone, laughed. "Hey, how can you say such a literary principle?" In one of the rooms of the inn, Jiang and I was lying on the table, staring at the dozen or so copper coins. She had asked the stingy Su Fengyan for one tael of silver that originally belonged to her. In the end, along the way, she was reluctant to buy anything. With great difficulty, she had steeled her heart and only picked 2 sets of the cheapest clothes and a cheap wooden hairpin. There were still some copper coins left. She was used to living a poor life. The little clay figurine seemed to have long forgotten the noble demeanor of growing up in the imperial family when she was young. No matter how angry she was at His Royal Highness, no matter how angry she was to the point that she could not eat, it would not affect her studies to earn money. These days, after leaving the Bailiang Palace, where everyone looked at her with disdain, she saw the scenery of the outside world. It was beautiful, but Jiang and I was not as interesting as she had originally imagined. If it were not for the company of Old Li, she privately felt that it would not be as good as Wudong Mountain. Over there, she could still have a vegetable garden. Looking at the little green, she always had some joy that she did not dare to admit. Originally, she secretly hoped that she could spend the winter on the mountain. That way, she could build a snowman as tall as a person. Then, she would not have to be as restrained as she was in the palace. She could viciously stab the snowballs in front of that hateful fellow. But in the end, she still went down the mountain. It was just that Jiang and I, whose hopes had been dashed, wasn't too upset. This was his fate, after all. What was there to complain about? The heavens couldn't hear him anyway. Old God of Swords Li came to the house and sat down. He tossed peanuts into his mouth and chewed loudly. Jiang and I was still staring at the copper coins in a daze. He said absent-mindedly, "Left." Old Man Li nodded and said, "Boring. This King of Jing and isn't a man at all. He's so cowardly even in his own territory. To think that he can hug such a plump and pretty lady and roll around in bed every night. He doesn't even have the slightest bit of heroic spirit." Originally, this old man didn't think much of that Su brat no matter how he looked at him. Today, After seeing the imposing manner of Jing and his son, he finally thinks that Su Brat is cute. Jiang and I raised his head and glared at him. The old god of swords smiled embarrassedly. He knew that his words wouldn't be pleasant to the little mudman's ears, so he didn't add fuel to the fire. He was just starting to get annoyed. This old man had already put down his airs and wanted to watch Su Fengyan practice his swordsmanship. This little brat, on the other hand, hadn't done anything for so many days from Mount Lao to Xiangfan. He didn't know how lucky he was to be able to get a few pointers from this old man. How many people yearned for an opportunity that they couldn't get? Li Chungang was an old fox that couldn't be any older. In fact, he had already guessed some clues. Su Fengyan had a cautious personality. To put it nicely, he had an outstanding temperament. To put it bluntly, he was as timid as a mouse. For the sake of the imperial court, he could resist getting close to women. For the sake of secrecy, he wouldn't easily reveal his swordsmanship in public. Occasionally, Li Chungang really wanted to use his finger to fiercely poke that brat's forehead and ask him if he was happy living like this. He was clearly a master who could cross the river no matter where he went. But what difference was there between him and a scoundrel struggling at death's door? Jiang and I sighed and said, "That Sister Guanyin outside the city is so beautiful. The one today is also very beautiful." The old god of swords laughed and said, "Little Jiang and I isn't any worse than them. In another 2 years you'll be even more beautiful. It's fine as long as a woman is young. This old man dares to say that they're all jealous of you." Jiang Ni's eyes lit up and asked, "Really?" The old man rolled his eyes and said, "Why would this old man lie to you?" Jiang and I immediately squinted his eyes and smiled. The 2 little dimples on his cheeks made even the old god of swords want to go drink. The old man was somewhat helpless. Jiang and I carefully put away the copper coins like a miser. He jogged to the bookcase and picked up a secret manual. Fine, he was obediently reading and earning money again. As a result, the old god of swords felt even more helpless. Chapter 186. The carriage coming out of Jing and palace looked simple and crude, but in fact, it was a world of its own. The interior walls were made of high-quality sandalwood, and there was a gold-plated sandalwood incense burner with a fine jade base. After Princess Pei boarded the carriage, she placed the book The First Snow on the table, crossed her legs, and rested her plump buttocks on them. She skillfully reached out to burn the sandalwood incense. The king of Jing and Zhao Heng and the crown prince, Zhao Sun, sat facing each other. Zhao Heng closed his eyes and turned the prayer beads that only had 107 Bodhi seeds left. No matter how important the matter was, the king of Jing and would always finish chanting before opening his eyes. Even though he knew that his father was meditating like an old monk, Zhao Sun still only dared to glance at his nominal mother out of the corner of his eye. After a complicated glance, he looked away and did not dare to look again. The king of Jing and chanted hundreds and thousands of times. When he opened his eyes, they were already near the palace. He said calmly, "Xianer, do you know your mistake?" Zhao Sun, who was sitting upright and still, said guiltily, "I know my mistake." Zhao Heng did not pursue the matter. He lifted the curtain and looked out of the carriage. He said indifferently, "I can't see through that child. It's all because of this king's superfluous actions that he made a wrong move." At this point, the king of Jing and's face darkened. He glanced at the submissive Princess Pei. Seeing that she did not respond like a marionette, he became more and more annoyed. He clenched the prayer beads, took a deep breath, and turned to Zhao Sun. He said, "At the Spring Lake, you wanted to take advantage of the chaos to kill him and shift the blame to the descendants of the Green faction. You had the idea, but you are still not good enough to judge the situation. Who is Su Fengyan? Lame Su is counting on him to carry Bailiang for the rest of his life. Did you really think that a few slaves, Ningame, and 100 cavalry would be enough? You are underestimating Jiang Hu. Without that old warrior surnamed Li, Su Fengyan would have died many times over." Zhao Sun lowered his head and said, "Father is right." Zhao Heng frowned, suppressing the irritation in his heart that could not be overcome no matter how much he chanted. He waved his hand to disperse some sandalwood that smelled too much as bad as not enough. Slowly, he said in a low voice, "The capital is very lively. Lame Su is most likely about to fulfill his wish and obtain a hereditary title for his son. However, it is highly likely that he will not be able to keep the title of Pillar of the State. Not only that, Gu Jiantong's journey north to the two Liao provinces was originally because that person in the imperial palace forced Lame Su to declare his position. Beiliang's 300,000 iron cavalry's foundation in the two Liao provinces. Lame Su will have to obediently uproot it himself. Beiliang still appears to be impregnable, and Zhang Baiyan may withdraw when he sees the opportunity. However, the remnants of the fallen state will probably make a move to beat a drowning dog. I just don't know how much of Lame Su's flesh will be bitten off in this dog-eat-dog show. These old dogs, who are #1 in the world in fishing for fame and reputation, only have this much prospects and use." When Zhao Sun heard his father's harsh evaluation of the old officials in the hall as a bunch of old dogs, he naturally smiled contemptuously. Only then did he recover the bearing of a vassal king and his royal highness should have. The dynasty originally had 13 provinces. Although they were now living in harmony with the people of 17 provinces of the 8 kingdoms of spring and autumn, how could they not have a natural sense of superiority in their hearts? If the common people were like this, then Zhao Sun and this small group of top-notch royal family members who rightfully regarded the whole world as their own private property. Furthermore, of the 6 vassal kings including Zhao Hong, except for the most useless Duke of Huainan, the rest had all participated in the War of Spring and Autumn. Each of them had their own military exploits. After the war ended, which vassal king's manor did not have a few concubines and princesses of the dead emperor as concubines and servants. Duke of Guangling even had an empress and 2 imperial concubines. Since that was the case, what status did the remaining elders of the 8 kingdoms have in their eyes? Even if you were resourceful and had a splendid military exploits, who would be foolish enough to worship you like a bodhisattva? Sitting at the same table, they all disliked dirtying their eyes. After getting off the carriage and returning to the Fu, the king of Jing'an, who was amiable and approachable with Su Fengnian at the inn, ignored the countless servants who knelt at the sight of him. Passing through the halls and corridors, they approached a Buddhist hall. Zhao Sun silently turned and left. Zhao Hong entered the dark hall where a red sandalwood statue of Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva was enshrined. Princess Pei hesitated and was about to turn when the prayer beads in Zhao Heng's hands, which were already missing a Bodhi seed, suddenly broke. The beads fell onto the white jade floor of the silent hall with an ear-piercing sound. Zhao Hong, who had personally destroyed the string of horse ropes, no longer had any concealment. With a ferocious expression, he stared fixedly at Wang Fei. Gnashing his teeth, he said, "Stop! Shameless thing, if you speak a few more words with that bastard Lame Su, will you even lose your soul?" Princess Pei did not refute and allowed the king of Jing and to humiliate her. At this moment, she was like the statue of the Bodhisattva, without the slightest bit of humanity. Outsiders all said that it was a great fortune for her, the orphan of the Pei family, to be able to marry into the Jing'an palace. Her skin was as white as snow. The rumor on the streets was that the king of Jing'an, who had won the beauty's heart, had an elegant hobby. He hid a 3-foot-tall jade statue and would play with the beauty at night. He was more charming than the jade statue. It was the envy of others. Just hearing about it was enough to make all the debauches in the world drool. The king of Jing'an did not stop there. He walked forward and grabbed Wang Fei's black hair, dragging her into the hall. He viciously threw her to the ground and yelled, "Pei Nan Wei, in what way is this king not worthy of a lowly slut like you? In these 10 years, when have you ever treated this king as your husband? Who is this king? Do you know? This king is only 1 step away from the dragon throne. 1 step? Who else in the world is more worthy than this king to wear the dragon robe?" Princess Pei, with her black hair scattered on the ground like a blooming lotus, finally raised her head and calmly asked, "Since I am a slut, how are you worthy?" King of Jing and Zhao Heng's expression froze. There was no more malice in his eyes. He crouched down and reached out to touch Wang Fei's face. He gently said, "Wei did this king hurt you?" Princess Pei turned her head away and softly said, "It doesn't hurt." Chapter 187. Zhao Heng was completely enraged by her dodging action. He slapped her, causing her, who was a noble Wang Fei, to fall to the ground. He suddenly stood up and angrily scolded, "The one surnamed Pei, you are more dead than a dead person. Since you have such backbone, why don't you die? Why didn't you accompany your father to die for the country? Throw yourself into a well? There are 64 wells in the mansion. Hanging beams? This king has rewarded you with so many brocades and silks over the years. Hitting the railings? There are so many in the mansion. Don't worry, after you die, this king will definitely give you a grand funeral." Princess Pei didn't look at the ruthless king of Jing'an. She only looked mournfully at the Ksitigarbha Bodhisattva, whose kasaya covered the mountains. She coldly said, "I'm afraid of death, so I married you." The king of Jing'an was filled with endless disgust. He turned his back to the woman who he hadn't seen clearly for more than 10 years and stiffly said, "Get out." Princess Pei stood up and tidied her hair and clothes. She bowed and walked out of the temple. When she crossed the threshold, she asked, "Bailiang's heir's gift. Should I accept it or not?" Zhao Heng sneered. "This king is still magnanimous. Just take it. This king knows that your painting skills are superb. Just don't use the prayer beads to do obscene things after drawing that bastard's portrait. You are degrading yourself. This king doesn't see it and doesn't feel annoyed. But if you stain the prayer beads and annoy the bodhisattva, then this king's years of praying for you will be wasted." Princess Pei indifferently said, "Oh." As soon as she left, the king of Jing and Zhao Heng suddenly became a different person. He was undistracted, as if he had just flipped through the extremely difficult scriptures in the house. He sat on a praying mat made of vanilla and coldly said, "Lame Su, do you really think that this king won't dare to touch your son? Hereditary title? This king has turned your 20 years of painstaking effort into a joke." Zhang and I wanted to read, so Su Fengyan reluctantly endured and listened to her read 2,000 words. Then he went to find Yu Wei and prepared to take her to Xiangfan's Diaoyu Terrace to view the scenery. There were several old Taoists from the Taoist master's mansion in the Diaoyu Terrace. Su Fengyan wanted to see if he could personally ask some news about Huang Man at Mount Longhu. However, he was still not at ease with the letters written by that ox-nosed old Taoist Zhao Shituan. Yu Wei wore a gorgeous embroidered fur coat bought from Mount Laoshan's Qingfu satin shop. It was a typical West Chu style, which could be called a pile of red brocade. Unfortunately, in Su Fengyan's eyes, it was a bit too tight. He didn't want Yu Wei's soft breasts to be slightly exposed, but he also didn't want to not show the slightest bit of charm. Yu Wei was originally an outstanding beauty with a romantic figure, especially those two proud piles of fat on her chest. Su Fengyan was a bastard who had seen and tasted the tempting taste of Yu Wei. Yu Wei was so tightly wrapped that he even killed the chance for his imagination to roam. Fortunately, she was holding her beloved white cat, which squeezed out some of the natural color of her breasts. Su Fengyan smiled and said to himself, "I didn't raise you for nothing, Wu Meinyang." After they went out, Su Fengyan considerately asked, "Have you seen Shouyang Lake?" Yu Wei shook her head. Thus, Su Fengyan first took her to take a slight detour, passing by a white snake embankment. It seemed that the scenic spots that were related to immortals were mostly sword immortals. He had never heard of any that were related to sabers. For example, the white snake embankment was said to be a land immortal several hundred years ago who couldn't stand a white snake stirring up trouble in the lake. He angrily slashed it with his sword, and after the white snake died, its huge body became a long embankment. The white snake embankment was like this, and so was the spring immortal lake. A saber user? There was no future. Su Fengyan, who was full of self-mockery, took Yu Wei along the way, which attracted a lot of attention. Some of the scholars who were touring the lake mustered up their energy to recite poems or sing loudly, hoping to win the favor of the lady holding the cat. Unfortunately, Yu Wei completely ignored them. Su Fengyan teased, "You didn't get to wear rouge, so don't you blame me?" Yu Wei just shook her head. Su Fengyan smiled and asked, Logically speaking, your father is the Jixia scholar of Shangyin Academy, so you should like the children of landowning households. But previously in Beiliang, I didn't hear you have a poem with any scholar? Yu Yue said softly. Because I know that those scholars who keep on saying that they don't work, don't farm, and that the emperor decrees me to sleep alone are all people who go crazy when the emperor decrees them. Those who say that they want to shock the old dragon with a sword in the sky are actually people who don't even dare to kill a chicken. What poetry can I talk to them about? Su Fengyan nodded and said, That's right. They can't compare to me, a vulgar guy who openly spends money to buy literature. Otherwise, why do they say that men only speak 30% of their words, and leave 70% to conquer the world? Yu Yue lowered her head and didn't say anything. After slowly walking out of Shouyang Lake, Su Fengyan rode on the horse that Lu Qiantang had brought over. There were only 5 horses in total, and he didn't give Yu Yue a chance to ride alone. After getting on the horse, His Royal Highness hugged the beauty, and the beauty hugged the white cat. They became a beautiful sight on the street. When he rode to the city gate and went up the city tower, he found out that the old Taoist priests of Mount Longhu who were guarding the fishing tower had already left Shangfan. It turned out that the heavenly talisman had already burned itself. No wonder the people of Shangfan were so happy. Su Fengyan climbed up the fishing tower, and no one dared to stop him. After entering the towering city tower, Su Fengyan sized up the layout of the city, while Yu Yue looked at the vast spring lake. Su Fengyan asked Ning Amei some questions about how to conduct a street battle after breaking through Shangfan's city gate. Ning Amei was a clear horse battle general. After entering the Beiliang army, he mostly accumulated military merits by killing the Beimang barbarians at the border. When the two sides fought, most of the time it was a contest of strength on the plains. As for His Royal Highness's questions about sieging the city, Ning Amei could only tell the surface of what he had heard from the old soldiers. Fortunately, Su Fengyan was still listening attentively, occasionally nodding his head. When he encountered something he didn't understand, he would always get to the bottom of it. Ning Amei, who was a dabbler in street battles, couldn't help but stare at His Royal Highness. The burly Ning Amei, who was dressed in casual clothes, finally had some free time. Seeing His Royal Highness stop and gaze into the distance, he asked carefully, Your Highness, why are you asking about these things? There's no chance of sieging a city on the Beiliang border. Su Fengyan smiled faintly and said, Books and secret manuals. As long as it's in the books, I can get it if I want it. It's just a matter of time. But those things that aren't in the books might just be trivial matters, but they're priceless treasures to me. Besides, if we don't attack the city now, won't our 300,000-strong cavalry be able to flatten Beimang in the future? Ning Amei, who was as strong as a bear, trembled. Su Fengyan turned his head and asked, General Ning, has Jing'an Palace accepted the sandalwood box I asked you to deliver? Ning Amei nodded and said, It's been accepted. Su Fengyan gazed at the faraway Jing and palace in the city and muttered, It doesn't matter if you see through me. Aren't you the most irreconcilable person in the world with that person in the capital? Chapter 188. There was a temple that had been closed for 1,000 years. No matter if it was an emperor or a commoner who came to burn incense, it was never opened. This mountain temple had produced countless eminent monks. The most famous one was Yang Taisui. He was the teacher of the current 2 dynasties and was very likely to be the teacher of the 3 dynasties in the future. There were more than 3,000 eminent monks who had passed away in the temple. Among them, more than 200 were titled as teachers of the state. It started from the Vajrayana Zen to the Zen Zen. In the Northern Wei dynasty, 36 bodhisattvas opened a translation field on the mountain at the same time. The Buddha's light shone everywhere. 800 years ago, the founder of the Zen sect, Yi, crossed the sea and taught the Mahayana wall temple. Finally, it became the ancestral court of Buddhism. For hundreds of years, Buddhism and Taoism had been fighting. Every 10 years, they would debate with Taoism. Buddhism would send monks from this temple to discuss with Mount Longhu. But it was different from the ancestral court of Taoism. There were not many rules here. Anyone could go up the mountain and go anywhere on the mountain. Here, the mountain was high, the temple was high, the tower was high, the Dharma was high, and the mountain was high. But like the name of the temple, Tu-Zen, it did not have a name. This was the world's number 1 Tu-Zen temples. Some people said that the reason why this temple was called Two Dhyanas was because it cultivated self-meditation and other meditation, namely meditation of oneself and meditation of others. But for more than 1,000 years, there did not seem to be a unified official statement. The two Zen temples also did not explain anything. At the back of the mountain, there was a forest of pagodas at the foot of the mountain. It was the burial place of the eminent monks of the two Zen temples. There were more than 1,000 of them. The size of the pagodas were different. The two Zen temples did not intend to make this a forbidden area. But the believers were devout and did not dare to set foot here. Over time, very few people came here to observe. There was 1,000 Buddha Hall at the edge of the forest of pagodas. The walls were painted with hundreds of meters-long fist manuals. There were 108 potholes on the floor. It was said that they were the footprints of Luohan. Thousands of people came to see thousands of fists. Therefore, it was praised that the world's fists were called Tu-Zen. On the east side of the 10,000 Buddha Hall, there was a small outhouse where a nameless white-robed monk lived all year round. If it wasn't for the fact that the bald man was wearing a kasaya, he wouldn't have looked like a monk at all. Not only did this white-robed middle-aged monk drink and eat meat, the most outrageous thing was that he had a wife. He even had a daughter who grew up in the temple. No matter how one looked at him, he was a middle-aged drunkard monk with evil deeds. Fortunately, apart from his unruly lifestyle, he did not make enemies with others. He only took in a good-tempered little disciple. In addition, his daughter was lively and liked to climb up and down the mountain. It was said that the oldest abbot in the temple liked this child very much. The white-robed monk inadvertently got into trouble several times and was chased and punished by the old-fashioned senior monks in the commandment yard. So he asked his daughter to go to the abbot's room to ask for a few sticks of sugar-coated haws to satisfy her cravings. As long as the old abbot looked at his little daughter, he would immediately calm down. The disciple of this middle-aged monk who guarded the pagoda forest was not simple. At a young age, he became a preaching monk in the temple and was allowed to wear a light red kasaya that covered his left shoulder. The little monk's Dharma name was Ichan. It was very strange, but compared to his master's Dharma name, it didn't seem strange. On a sunny day, the poor little monk sat in front of the outhouse and washed a large basin of his master and mistress' clothes. He sighed. On the day of the Lantern Festival, he went down the mountain to watch the Lantern Festival. In the end, he was accidentally dragged to Mount Longhu by that thing. At the Taoist master's residence, he had a few words with Mr. White Lotus. Fortunately, he wasn't locked up and beaten. However, as soon as he returned to the temple, he suffered a calamity. His mistress was indeed lazy. She didn't wash so many dirty clothes and didn't mind piling them in the room. She didn't want to leave until she returned to the temple. Moreover, it was clearly that thing's idea to sneak out to play. When my master and mistress saw that thing, they were still so kind. When they turned to look at me, they changed their expressions. When I ate, even the rice in my bowl was much less. This thing should be going down the mountain with his mistress to buy rouge and face powder. Master was actually quite pitiful. A drunk monk in white clothes walked out of the outhouse. He was very tall and sat down next to the little monk. He also had a bitter face. The little monk didn't even want to look at him. In fact, his master didn't have it easy either. The little monk washed the clothes until his waist and back ached. He was very bored, so he could only casually ask, "Master, when I went up the mountain, I heard that a famous monk from the south came to the temple. He's fighting with Abbot Huinang for territory. Who do you think will win?" The monk in white yawned and unhappily said, "A foreign monk is good at chanting scriptures. Besides, your martial uncle Huinang's fighting skills are about the same as yours. He most likely won't win." The little monk curled his lips and angrily said, "You're not willing to teach me profound martial arts. What can I do? I've looked at the martial arts manuals on the 3 walls of the 1,000 Buddha Hall for so many years, but I really can't see how powerful they are." This master didn't have the slightest sense of responsibility and half-heartedly said, "That's why that thing said you're an idiot." The stupid north-south sighed and said, "Master, do you think I'll be able to create a Buddhist relic in this lifetime? If I can't, I think it's better for me to go practice martial arts. That thing always likes to run down the mountain. I'm afraid she'll be bullied. I can't beat her." The monk in white thought for a moment and said, "If that's the case, then you can first use those 8 or 9-year-old novice monks in the temple as punching bags. After a while, you'll become a master." The little monk said angrily, "You've said this before. Last year, I listened to you and went to beat up a novice monk. In the end, the monk's master came to scold me. You, on the other hand, just ran away. Master's wife almost pulled my ear off." The middle-aged monk pretended to be surprised and said, "There's such a thing?" The little monk, who had accepted his fate, lowered his head and fiercely rubbed his dirty clothes. There was no movement for a long time. The little monk turned his head and saw that his master was looking up at the cloudless sky in a daze. He couldn't help but ask, "Master, what are you looking at?" The monk in white stretched out a finger and pointed. The little monk instinctively looked at his master's finger. Very quickly, his master knocked him on the head and scolded, "You're not convinced that you're an idiot. I've already pointed it out for you. What are you looking at? With such a slow comprehension, you still want to burn a Buddhist relic after you die?" The stupid north-south first wiped his wet hands on his pants and then rubbed little bald head. He was ready to get to the bottom of this matter. Otherwise, he would have been beaten for nothing. "Master, you haven't told me what I'm looking at." His master said seriously, "I'm looking at the moon." The little monk rolled his eyes and said, "Master, can you see it in broad daylight?" No wonder his master's Buddhist name was No Zen. The monk in white raised his head and said softly, "Sigh, the first time I saw your master's wife, it was under the moonlight. Stupid north-south, I miss your master's wife again." The little monk said angrily, "Just think about it. Why are you telling me?" His master asked, "Don't you miss her?" The stupid north-south immediately laughed foolishly. He washed his clothes more diligently and said naively, "Of course I do. Why wouldn't I?" His master knocked him on the head again and then said earnestly, "Why are you telling your master about the things you miss? You know that she's my daughter, but you still get beaten up by me. You idiot. I've taught you so many profound Buddhist teachings in vain." The little monk said angrily, "If you hit me again, be careful that you don't have an epiphany. At that time, I'll become a Buddha and burn a Buddhist relic. Then, I'll be able to see if she's paying attention to you." His master said disdainfully, "Epiphany is what I taught you. As for the Buddhist relic, I don't care about it at all. Don't pretend to be a hero in front of me. If you have the ability, go to your master's wife and raise your voice." The little monk was filled with grief and indignation, but he did not make a sound. The stupid north-south only found out that his master was more profound than he had imagined after he left the mountain. There was a saying at the foot of the mountain. His master, who had also grown up on the mountain, spent 6 years in Ganlu and read all the scriptures in the world. He felt that there were many sects and all of them had different doctrines. His master said that he wanted to sacrifice himself and go thousands of miles away to seek a big foundation. Thus, he went west to seek Buddhism. He left for 15 years. Isn't Lantua Mountain in the western regions far enough? But his master wanted to go even further. He obtained the Yogi's Treatise on Earth to unify all the different doctrines. He studied in a temple in the far west for 10 years and mastered 50 scriptures. He returned in the 31st year of Ganlu. When he arrived at Great Peace City, it was said that even the emperor personally came out of the palace to welcome him. There were hundreds of thousands of spectators lining the streets, fighting to see the white-clothed monk. Thus, there was a snow pavilion in the temple. The late emperor personally wrote the words "white snow heart reflecting pearl." If he only came here, the little monk, stupid north-south, would definitely feel like he was listening to a story. Later, his master brought up the idea of becoming a Buddha on the spot in the temple. This was contrary to the orthodoxy of Zen. As a result, his master's 15-year journey became a farce and he was almost chased out of the 2 Zen temples. His master's so-called every action is in the Taoist field whether it is the heart or the feelings, all return to the sea of nature, was only slightly recognized in recent years. No matter what, the scene of hundreds of thousands of people kneeling and worshipping Buddha together in the capital was no longer there. Fortunately, his master had one thing that the little monk admired. No matter how the people at the foot of the mountain looked at or refuted him, it was not as effective as a single word from his master's wife. The white-clothed monk smiled and said, "Stupid North-South, your master is no longer in the mood to compete with others. I'll rely on you to carry forward the concept of epiphany." The little monk said nervously, "Master, don't you have your master's wife? But don't I have my master's wife? Most likely I won't be able to take care of your Zen." The white-clothed monk looked a little annoyed. He touched his big bald head and laughed. "I really envy you, stupid. Your master has no Zen to talk about." The little monk sighed. His master said softly, "It's going to rain. It's going to be sunny. Can't be, right? It's going to rain. Master." Why do you always say such nonsense? Aren't all the Dharma in the scriptures like this? Keep your voice down. If the abbot hears you, he'll deduct our copper coins again. Tacky. You want to burn a Buddhist relic like this? What's wrong? I want to become a Buddha because I don't have money to buy my master's rouge. Otherwise, why would I burn myself to ask for a Buddhist relic? Chapter 189. Oh, not bad, not bad. You have the ability to comprehend and have a good foundation. You are indeed my disciple. Master, if that's the case, why don't you help me wash some clothes? You're asking for a beating. Huding County in Gangnam-do was not famous for its plump lotus peony, but for a dissolute widow with the surname Su. She had married from Baelyong and had cursed 2 of her husbands to death. Both of her husbands were top-notch nobles in the area. One of them was ranked 2nd in the imperial examination and had passed away in the imperial examination. It was supposed to be a joyous occasion, but he had died an unnatural death. The other one was not bad either. He was ranked 3rd in the imperial examination and had also passed away suddenly after marrying the widow surnamed Su. Therefore, people in Gangnam-do jokingly asked if the next top scorer would be the one to suffer. However, this widow had recently hooked up with a scholar from Jiangxin County next door. That man was the son of an elegant official in Gangnam-do. His father's generation were all literary heroes. This man's surname was Lu Lighting, also known as Mr. Chengzhai. At the age of 14, he could compose beautiful poems and was proficient in voice and rhythm. He was especially immersed in playing the zither and was famous for his culinary skills. He had a unique style among the scholars in Gangnam-do. His first wife was also from a big family and had both integrity and talent. However, after meeting the widow, Lu Lighting went crazy and wanted to divorce her. Originally, it was just a matter between 2 families. At most, it would be a joke in Gangnam-do. However, for some reason, Lu Lighting's wife had an inextricable relationship with an imperial concubine in the capital. That imperial concubine was extraordinary, and the precepts for women, that all women in the world had to read, was written by her. When such a scandal reached the ears of the imperial concubine in Gangnam-do, she naturally flew into a rage. This imperial concubine was extremely favored in the imperial palace and was even treated as a sister by Empress Zhao. Therefore, when she frowned, it was not too far off from the anger of the emperor. Therefore, the high-ranking officials in Gangnam-do no longer dared to have any thoughts of watching the drama and braced themselves to denounce her. Although Lu Lighting wrote a moral essay that made people want to slap the table in praise, it did not seem very manly. When he saw that even the imperial concubine in the palace was angry, he immediately sobered up. First, he wrote a poem to break off all relations and sent it to the widow's door. Then, he went to his wife and bitterly complained to a group of scholars that he was on good terms about how the seductive widow had seduced him. For a moment, the pitiful woman surnamed Su was besieged on all sides. If it were not for her family's strong background, she would have drowned in the spit of saliva. Lu Lighting's wife even specially went to Baogwa Temple to burn incense and slapped her, calling her a slut. That seductive widow was not angry at all and only smiled faintly. It was unclear whether it was a bitter smile or a sneer. At that time, the scholars who were present to watch the drama were all moved. The peonies of Baogua Temple were the best in Jiangnan. According to the study of geography, the earth veins of Huding County were the most suitable for peonies. That was why they were able to cultivate such beautiful flowers. At that time, Huding County's two unique peonies, Yao Huang and Wei Zi, were sent to the capital as tributes. The flowers bloomed and withered for 20 days. The entire capital was in a frenzy. There were no less than 100 types of peonies in Baogua Temple. Other than the Yao Huang and Wei Zi that were known as the Queen of the Peonies, there were many other treasures such as Green Dragon Crouching Lake, Zhao Fun, Flesh Hibiscus, and so on. The biggest pilgrim in Baogua Temple was the widow Su, who was currently being condemned by everyone. Every 1st and 15th day of the month, she would come to burn incense and worship, rain or shine. She only loved the peonies Zhao Fun. In the backyard of the temple, there was a Zhao Fan that was as big as a bucket. Its branches and leaves were scattered, dripping and clustered, and it was staggered out of the eaves. Due to her illustrious family background and eccentric style in Huding County, this unique peonies had almost become her exclusive ornamental attraction. Today was the 15th day of the month. The first day of the month was the day she was slapped in the face by Mrs. Liu. She brought a personal maid into the backyard. When she left home to get married, she brought many servants and maids with her, but she was not close to any of them. Only this maid, who came from a poor family, liked her very much for no reason. She was strict in governing her family. There were few servants in the residence who did not harbor fear in their hearts. Only this maid, whom she named Xiao Er, knew how to repay kindness and protected her master in all respects. Today, when she got off the horse and walked into the temple, countless people were secretly pointing at her. The little maid was angry. Now that there was no one around, she bitterly defended the injustice and said, "Miss, these pilgrims are really hateful. If they want to burn incense, then they should burn incense. Why are they secretly laughing when they see Miss?" The widow, who was not yet 30 years old, pinched the maid's face and said with a charming smile, "You still have a conscience." The little maid said indignantly, "Miss, that Liu lighting is too much." During those days, he was the one who pestered Miss like a dog-skin plaster. In the end, the villain complained first. Are those scholars who are well-read and well-read all blind? Why are they all speaking up for him? The pretty widow could not help but laugh. She bent down to look at a gorgeous peony. She pinched off a small petal the size of a fingernail with her fingers and sniffed it. She squinted her eyes and said with a smile, "Aren't most men in the world like this? What's there to be angry about? It's not worth it to be angry about it." The little maid said timidly, "Miss, let's talk about something." The widow was amused and said, "Oh, are you thinking of love? Which scholar have you taken a fancy to? Tell me if he's really not bad." The little maid shook her head desperately and bit her lips. She looked up with a determined face and said, "Miss, the shrew in Liu Lighting's house is too hateful. I heard that she often goes to Mount Qing Temple to worship. I want to slap her in the face. I beg Miss not to plead for Chow Chow. If I'm beaten to death, I'll be beaten to death. I want to help Miss vent her anger. I know Miss is not having a good day today, so please don't worry about me anymore." She was stunned for a moment. She gently pinched the petal with 2 fingers and laughed involuntarily. "I didn't feel sorry for you in vain, but you're just a little girl. Why are you involved? If you're slapped in the face, then you're slapped." Chapter 190. The little girl was so anxious that she cried. Her face was full of tears as she sobbed, "No, as long as I think about Miss being bullied for no reason, I want to fight that shrew with my life. If Miss didn't save me, I would have been defiled by that wicked person. I've never studied and can't read, but when my parents were alive, they always said that I should remember other people's good deeds. I remember Miss's good deeds the most." The widow wiped the little girl's tears and said softly, Okay, I didn't want to say it, but seeing you like this, I'll tell you so that you can rest assured. As for me, I purposely kept that slap. You also know that I have an unruly younger brother. He's very busy on this trip. Originally, I wasn't sure if this younger brother would first visit his second sister or come to Ting County to visit me, his eldest sister. If he heard about this slap, wouldn't he have rushed over to my place? His second sister cares about the world and doesn't care about this. I can't do that. I always like to fight. It's rare that I don't suffer in life. This is one of my few pleasures. The little girl nodded vigorously and said, "Yes, I know that Mrs. Younger brother is Baelyong, His Royal Highness." The servants in the mansion always like to whisper about His Highness, but every time they see me, they shut up. The widow rubbed the little girl's ears and said with a smile, "With you as my ear, who in the mansion dares to gossip? If I find out, won't they be skinned and have their tendons pulled out?" The little girl finally smiled through her tears. Her miss seemed to be in a good mood every time she talked about His Highness. The widow's brows really relaxed a bit. She said with a smile, "My younger brother has been good-looking since he was young. We don't plant many peonies at home, but every time the flowers bloom, I'll take him to admire the flowers. I pick them and put them on his head. He's prettier than a girl. Unfortunately, it's going to rain in a few days. I don't know if he can make it in time." The little girl wiped her face with her sleeve and said innocently, "The Bodhisattva will definitely protect Miss from the rain." The widow whispered softly, "Little girl, how can you understand the pain of the heartless wind and rain breaking up a romantic romance?" The little girl, who couldn't hear clearly, asked curiously, "What did Miss say?" The widow teased, "You won't understand even if I tell you." As if she was afraid that the little servant girl would do something stupid, the widow said softly, "When my little brother arrives at the Jiangnan circuit, you will know how those noble scholars and rich children who usually have their eyes at the top of their heads are not worth anything." At the top of the mountain was the residence of the Taoist master, where the nobles of purple and yellow gathered. At the foot of the mountain was a dilapidated old Taoist temple, where a pair of master and disciple depended on each other. The master, the old Taoist master, wanted his disciple to improve. At first, the old Taoist master's ultimate skill was the dream of spring and autumn. This was a Taoist secret art that even the four great Taoist masters couldn't practice. The disciple didn't want to learn or listen to it. Until one day, the old Taoist master was enlightened. He took a letter from the Baelyong, His Royal Highness, and purposely said that it was from Su Fengnian. In the letter, he hoped that Huang Manor could learn the spring and autumn Taoist method that could make one sleep for 500 years. As a result, he did it by accident. His foolish disciple pricked up his ears and really learned the dream of spring and autumn with all his heart. It wasn't difficult to memorize this method, but the difficult part was how to operate the qi. The great yellow kingdom sought thick, but the dream of spring and autumn was the opposite. It sought thin, and when practiced to the peak of mystery, there would be almost no qi in the body. The reason why the old Taoist master valued his disciple Su Longxiang and humbled himself to beg the king of Baelyong was because Su Longxiang was born with great strength and was in the terrifying Vajra realm. If he learned the dream of spring and autumn, he would be like a tiger with wings. How could the old Taoist master Zhao Shituan not hope that there would be a second Qi Shenzhong on the mountain? As for whether Su Longxiang came from the Taoist master's residence, Zhao Shituan didn't care at all. In this life, there were many people from the Taoist master's residence who called him a traitor. In the past, it was Su Longxiang who refused to learn. As his master, the old Taoist priest had a headache. But now, the old Taoist priest Zhao still had a headache. That kid had gone berserk. He was half asleep and half awake 24 hours a day. This spring and autumn dream was simply tailor-made for Su Longxiang. The old Taoist master could have squatted with his disciple to watch the ants or the stream. Even if they couldn't talk, at least he had a companion to listen to his nagging. But now, the old Taoist master had nothing to do and was too bored. He could only count on his fingers to calculate when His Royal Highness would come to Mount Longhu. The old Taoist master, who had an extremely high seniority and an extremely strange temper, was squatting by the green dragon stream in a daze. He was fretting over why he couldn't see the beautiful girl on the raft. The disciple who never spoke walked out of the Taoist temple for the first time and squatted by the side. The old Taoist master, who was incomparably gratified, laughed and said, "My disciple, you've finally come out to take a breather?" As expected, there was no response. The old Taoist master said to himself, "I've been pursuing the Tao all my life, but I can't see it clearly. I feel like it's covered by clouds and mist. In the end, when I see you, I realize that this Tao is not Tao." Su Longxiang just stared blankly at the stream. The old Taoist master sighed and said, "One day before we go down the mountain, I'll take you to see an old senior. It'll be enough if you can withstand 100 moves." Huang Manor plucked a leaf and handed it to his master. The old Taoist master took the leaf and smiled bitterly. "Your disciple, I don't know how to whistle." "Huang Manor, do you miss your brother?" The dazed Su Longxiang actually smiled and nodded. The old Taoist master felt a little sad. "Your brother will arrive when there are hawthorns on the mountain." Although the old Taoist master had heeded Bailiang's advice to dress up properly before going down the mountain, and had even specially borrowed a zhong kue peach with sword from his disciples, he was still a mess on the mountain. The straw sandals he wore were made by himself, and his Taoist robes were tattered and covered in dust. At this moment, Huang Manor lowered his head and stretched out his withered arm to pat the dust off the old Taoist master's body. The old Taoist master, who had no wife, no children, and no grandchildren for the sake of the word Tao, was stunned on the spot. In an instant, tears streamed down his face. Chapter 191. Su Fengyan left Jiaoyu Terrace and wandered around the city with Yu Yuwei. He saw an alley crowded with people, and there was no lack of young scholars in green robes. As he walked closer to take a look, he found that they were gambling on chess. There were people squatting, sitting, and standing. Su Fengyan then remembered that other than Xianggua Alley being a money-squandering den in Shangfan, this Yongzi Alley was also quite famous. The people sitting against the wall in the alley were all nogi with chess pieces and chess boxes. They used the strength of their chess skills to bet different amounts to lure tourists and chess addicts who were itching to play. This kind of game was naturally difficult to attract the attention of the chess masters, but it was the best way to waste the time of the common people and poor scholars. In addition, the bets were usually no more than a dozen copper coins, so it could be considered a small gamble to entertain the mood. Su Fengyan smiled and took a bite of the marinated beef wrapped in oiled paper. In the past, he was penniless and hungry, so there was a period of time when he gambled in the alley to earn money. With his chess skills trained by scholar Li Yishan and Su Weisheng, it was not difficult for him to win. However, there were often people of the same trade who had to make a living. Those who were reasonable would mind their own business, but those who were unreasonable would use the fact that they were locals to drive His Royal Highness away. In addition, there were rules to winning chess. One could not kill the dragon easily, but one had to keep a sense of propriety and win a few pieces. Otherwise, if the opponent was defeated, they would not be willing to continue playing chess. This was the vulgar truth that Su Fengyan was forced to slowly understand. His Royal Highness had LV Yangshu and the other two stand further away, leaving only Ning Amei standing behind him. He pulled Yu Yue and found a gap to make use of. The player who placed the bet was a young man who looked like a down-and-out student. His clothes were mended and his shoes and socks were white. In front of him, there were 10 chess pieces placed on the chessboard. This meant that if the player who placed the chess pieces lost, he would have to pay 10 sets of money. Usually, only 2 or 3 chess pieces would be placed on the board. It was rare to see 5 chess pieces. Could be seen that this nogi was quite confident. Su Fengyan squatted down and was hesitating whether he should take out a few copper coins to place his bet. When he looked up, he saw that the player was blind. How could he play this game? As if accustomed to this situation, the blind player warmly said, "It's okay. When I hear the sound of a chess piece being placed, I will know where to place it." Su Fengyan nodded and said, "I'll place a bet of 10 copper coins." The blind player took out his money pouch from his sleeve and weighed it in his hand. With an ashamed expression, he said softly, "Young master, if I lose, I will owe you 16 copper coins. If you don't mind, I have a chess manual that has been passed down from my ancestors. It should be worth that amount." Su Fengyan smiled and said, "Okay." Su Fengyan didn't really care about chess manuals. There were countless chess manuals in the Tide Listening Pavilion that could make famous chess players go crazy, such as the Peach Blossom Spring Chess Manual, the Exquisite South Sea Game Manual, the Immortal Bestowment Manual, and so on. His Highness could pile them up into a small mountain, let alone now that the chessboard had turned from 15 to 19. Usually, the older a chess manual was, the less valuable it was. Generally speaking, the strength of the muscles in the hands of ancient and modern chess players was getting stronger and stronger. The blind player, who was sitting cross-legged against the wall, had a box of black chess pieces under his knees. He spread out his hands slightly and gestured for Su Fengnian to go first with white. Although this nogi was dressed shabbily, his bearing was not to be underestimated. His every move revealed the refined and ancient style of a true aristocratic family. Before the official match, both sides would place 2 chess pieces on opposite sides of the board, which were called positions. These were the positions of ancient chess pieces. To a large extent, they limited the advantage of going first. Moreover, they were destined to fight fiercely in the middle of the board. Su Fengnian passed the marinated beef to Yu Yue and took the lead to place a 3-6. This position was rated as the best aggressive position by the self-proclaimed Huang Sanjia Grandmaster, Huang Longshi. The young blind player's expression was calm. Indeed, he could distinguish positions by listening. The black chess piece was placed with a 9-3 and was in a stalemate with the white chess piece. Following that, each of the 9 black and white chess pieces were placed with the same style as their predecessors. Yu You's father, who was watching from the side, was once an illustrious chess master in West Chu. When he was studying at Shangyin Academy, he was only defeated by Huang Longshi, who was said to have unparalleled battle prowess. Since young, she had been influenced by her father's chess style. Naturally, she was proficient in chess theory. Perhaps even the small Beiliang chess player Lu Yi of Wutong Garden would not dare to say that he could win against Yu Yue. Yu Yue was somewhat disappointed when they saw each other's 10 moves. However, Su Fengnian's 11 moves made Yu You's eyes brighten. The blind player was also slightly stagnant. He no longer placed his chess piece at lightning speed. After thinking for a moment, he picked up his piece and placed it again. As the old saying goes, a chess piece is born from a break. Su Fengnian's next few moves were all born from this break. Could be said that this was an ingenious move. The blind player endured patiently all the way. Finally, the black 18 made the first move before the corner was settled. 5 or 6 flew attacks. Yu Yue frowned and pondered deeply. This move had as many as 44 changes. She subconsciously looked at Su Fengnian. He was still calm and collected. His speed of placing chess pieces was the same from beginning to end. When the white 43 moved gently, the chessboard was instantly filled with murderous intent. Yu Yue watched with trepidation. This move was really too ferocious. The white 59 flew to add, and the 83-pointed attack was similarly aggressive. Unexpectedly, the blind player's situation was like a small boat in the ocean. It swayed but did not fall. After the black 18 moves, victory was already firmly in his grasp. Su Fengnian very calmly admitted defeat. Su Fengnian took out another 10 copper coins and said, "Still 10 wins." The blind player played white first. In this game, Su Fengnian stirred up the smoke early, and the blind player calmly responded. Yu Yue vaguely saw some clues. Su Fengnian was extremely aggressive, but the blind player was not the same as most people. The most important thing was the formation of the terrain. Some of the moves that seemed to be casually placed could always resonate with the middle game and even the ending game. If Su Fengnian did not rely on endless tricks to forcibly set off waves of unreasonable killing, the 2 games would not have lasted more than 200 moves. At the moment, Su Weisheng, who was a woman of great talent, changed 15 to 19 and broke the position system. In Yu You's view, the blind player who was slightly better than His Royal Highness was destined to amaze the world. Moreover, it was hard to say whether this player was hiding his strength or not. Indeed, it was a case of hidden dragons in the marketplace and crouching tigers in the alley. Again, Su Fengnian, who had lost 2 games in a row, chuckled softly. This time he played white and started with 2 swallows. This routine was once widely spread, but in the past 50 years, The most outstanding national players had all abandoned it in the fierce battles of the Summit Challenge. Huang Longsher even said that the two swallows were too tight at the beginning and lost its mellow flavor. It could be said that he had given this classic layout a death sentence. Su Fengyan simply sat on the ground. As a result, he changed to a more comfortable position. On the chessboard, he was defeated like a mountain. He easily lost 3 games in a row. There was already a pile of 30 copper coins in front of the blind player. Su Fengyan raised his head and looked at the sky through the eaves of Yongzi Alley. It was already time for dinner. However, it was rare to meet Nogi, who was so good at chess. He waved his hand and called Xu Xiu to his side, asking her to go to the wine shop to get some food. Soon, Xu Xiu carried a large food box with 4 pairs of bowls and chopsticks. After Yang Qingfeng tested that the food was not poisonous, Xu Xiu dared to put it in front of Su Fengyan. Su Fengyan smiled and asked, "I don't plan to leave for a while. Do you want to eat some?" The blind player did not care about trifles and nodded with a smile. Yu Wei was a pampered girl who lived like a princess. She did not feel like she was losing her composure when eating with Su Fengyan. The halberd Ningame, on the other hand, was standing and wolfing down the food in a few mouthfuls. As Nogi ate slowly, he even took the initiative to talk to Su Fengyan about the gains and losses of the 3 defeats. When he talked about Su Fengyan's skillful moves, he did not hide his admiration. When he talked about his moves, he also straightforwardly pointed out the shortcomings. Su Fengyan frequently nodded and benefited a lot. They chatted happily. Su Fengyan smiled and asked the blind player if he had learned from a famous chess master. The blind player shook his head and said that his family background was ordinary. Before he lost his sight, he had just started playing chess. After losing his sight, he had no one to rely on and could only play chess as a companion. He had been playing chess in Yongzi Alley for almost 10 years. The money he earned was only enough for him to eat and wear. Whenever he had free time, he would buy chess manuals and did not save a single bit of money. As he spoke, the blind player patted his head and took out a few Confucian classics from his bag. He handed them to Su Fengyan, whose butt could only touch the floor. He chuckled and said, "Cushion." Su Fengyan took the books and took out 2 to give to Yu Wei, whose legs were already numb. He smiled and said, "Isn't this inappropriate? It's a disgrace to the teachings of the saints." The blind player smiled and shook his head. Propriety, justice, integrity, and shame are not in the books. Su Fengyan was no longer pretentious. He ate and drank to his heart's content with the wild chess player in front of him who had won 31 from him. Once again, smoke rose from the 19 paths. Su Fengyan repeatedly lost and did not feel tired. When the blind chess soldiers came, he blocked the water, and when the earth blocked the earth. His chess pieces were crisp and his expression was calm. The 10 games in Yongzi Alley were fought until the sky turned dark. From noon to dusk to moonlight, the dust settled. Su Fengyan lost 10 games in a spurt of energy and paid 100 copper coins. Nogi had already left Yongzi Alley. Su Fengyan sat cross-legged in front of a Confucian classic. He looked at the losing game on the chessboard and sighed heavily. He said, "With your skill, you can compete with Su Weisheng from the Yin Academy."